Alice snickered and then said, "Not probably. This was orchestrated by him. I'll head over to have a chat with him now." "All right. I'm not very proficient in this area, so I'm counting on you." "If I were to go, I'd probably kill a few people," Goliath answered. "Leave it to me. However, you have to help me with that problem," Alice exclaimed straightforwardly. "Deal. I've got a good impression of Richard, but I'm not sure if he'll be able to convince Gatton. He can only try his best." Goliath's smile widened as he laughed. Asterisk clop. Clop, asterisk. The sound of hooves rang out like thunder at the end of the boulevard. A team of knights dressed in golden armor and red caps, the splendid attire of the Imperial Guards, turned around the corner and quickly charged to the end of the street. The leading knight saw the pool of limbs and blood, paying attention to the emblems of the Josephs and Archerons, and the corner of his eye involuntarily twitched. He immediately jumped off his warhorse, walking up to Goliath and speaking with a bow. "I am Dean, leader of the Imperial Patrol. May I know how to address you, and what exactly happened here?" Goliath hugged his arms. "I'm Earl Goliath Archeron, Lord of the Westway Province. As for what happened, there's a fair number of people here who saw the entire thing from start to end. I am willing to accompany you to the assembly and explain everything." Dean's pupils shrank the moment he heard Goliath's name, and he began to act even more respectfully. He turned around immediately, having the knights under him invite some clerics and priests over. Nobody except a few servants had really died, but if they continued to dither, a life would be lost. And that might be considered his fault. While he was doing all this, Goliath stood calm and motionless like a mountain. Raymond had already stowed away the precious monocular, but he didn't leave. He instead seemed to be waiting for something. 3 knocks sounded from the door to the room, following which the door was opened without approval. Alice Archeron walked in, stabbing her large sword into the ground before she pulled a chair up and sat before Raymond. Raymond stood up and bowed towards Alice, speaking with a smile. "It's my honor to meet the Archeron's beautiful goddess of war." Alice was completely unmoved by this and said dully, "Sorry, but I don't plan on being courteous to true enemies. However, I do have to admit that this scheme of yours was truly unexpected, and you almost succeeded." Raymond took a seat and calmly smiled. "Almost doesn't mean success. However, my only loss this time was in the field of luck. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 88. Punishment. Alice nodded in approval. Luck is a very important part of one's power. Offer some more sacrifices to the eternal dragon. Also, don't think that sending Amilan and Chef packing means you'll be able to deal with the other Archerons. Those 2 pieces of trash are a disgrace. Honestly, I'm quite regretful that our territories are 3,000 kilometers apart. Raymond laughed. "I find it regretful too. If our territories were to be joined together, that might have been enough to form a marquisate. However, the true wars are fought on the endless plains. I anticipate the day when I come to know the coordinates of yours." Alice smiled. "I anticipate the same thing. However, I'm afraid what happened today can't be resolved so easily. You've already infuriated Gatton, and even I'm a little afraid of that guy. Take care of that little barony of yours, but..." Having said this, Alice stood up and headed outside the room. She suddenly turned around at the doorway, scanning everyone in the room and saying indifferently, "If I were you, I'd definitely return home more often in the near future to see if anything's happened." In that moment, the expressions of practically everyone but Raymond and Valen changed. They all understood the threat behind Alice's words. The incident with Falk was a terrible opening. The fight between their families would no longer abide by the age-old traditions of nobility, and the Archerons would begin to use underhanded means as well. A long while after Alice left, Raymond sobered up from his thoughts. The atmosphere in the room was stifling, and everyone looked terrible. The Joseph family had a long history, and as experts who depended on the Josephs, each and every one of the people here was a small noble with their own land. Valen and Naseby themselves were barons, the titles inheritable, which was why Alice's threat was straightforward and effective. The results of Falk's failure was obvious. The big shots of the major families were no fools, and they would see through the conspiracy behind this matter. Later this very same day the news would spread out, and would include some details outside the actual scene as well. Time had been tight, and they would not be able to erase all traces. Now they would have to expect the Archeron's revenge. Falk being injured and crippled was a part of the price, but that was not enough. The only reason he wasn't killed was that Goliath wanted to avoid any issues that would bring, and also to leave some room for them to exact a more proper revenge. Or perhaps they would use this as a pretext, making a big fuss about it. They would follow the culture of revenge amongst nobility, an eye for an eye, blood for blood, and plunder until the price had been paid. However, things were different if the Archerons targeted these minor nobles. Although they were part of the Joseph family's core strength, they were not a part of it by blood. Outside of Valen and Naseby, the rest of their families hadn't accompanied them for generations, so Duke Joseph would likely be willing to let them go. Poison Snake, for instance, was only an expert temporarily hired by them. Even as he was dying, probably thought that the fight was just a battle between two hedonistic children of large families, with no idea of what was truly going on. Even if he died, the Joseph family could just hand over some compensation in the form of gold. In the eyes of families with great backgrounds like them, gold was one of the least valuable things. Their values to the Josephs followed a similar logic. Although they could be considered experts individually, experts were the thing the Archerons lacked the least. If the Archerons went all out on them, nobody in their midst would be able to escape. The Josephs did have people able to contend against Goliath, and even Gatton or Mordred, but the issue was that they would not send out these people just for a few trivial characters like them. Even if this situation was on a bigger scale and applied to the family, things would still be the same. Now, just Gatton alone could contend against the entire Joseph family. If all the Archerons were seen as a single entity, then in terms of individual strength, they had an absolutely crushing advantage over the Josephs. Thankfully, this bunch of lunatics had never truly worked together, and some even betrayed and sold each other out. An example would be what had just transpired. However, the temporary alliance between Gatton, Goliath, and Alice was already enough to cause Duke Joseph a headache. It would be a simple task to deal with those people who were attached to the family. Thus, all eyes landed on Raymond in that moment. If the Joseph family was willing to protect them, then the Archerons would target the direct descendants of Joseph. However, this matter. Raymond gazed at these subordinates that had followed him for many years, and gently said, with Alice's personality, that was definitely not an empty threat. Hence, if the family is to protect you, then there is a large possibility of war with the Archerons. Everyone's expressions turned even worse. But then Raymond smiled with confidence. However, I have no habit of abandoning my comrades. I anticipate exchanging blows with Alice, and even Gatton, on the battlefield. But everyone, including Valen, heaved a sigh of relief. Joy and gratitude surged in their hearts. Meanwhile, Richard had returned to the Archeron island, and Senma disappeared immediately after handing him to the butler. The arrow from Poison Snake was actually extremely dangerous, with astounding power that allowed it to penetrate both her magical armor and skin, reaching deep into her internal organs. The poison and indistinguishable curses attached to it were already eating away at her strength, and only by relying on an unknown tenacity had she managed to bring the boy home. The butler was shocked upon seeing Richard's state. The boy's forehead, the back of his skull, and many other vulnerable areas were all bruised black and blue, with blood still seeping out of some parts. His clothes were completely ripped apart at the chest, abdomen, and back, obviously not from tearing but from powerful attacks to his body. It was easy to imagine the harm that must have been done to him. When a powerful cleric from the family was rushed over, he wrinkled his forehead upon seeing the state of Richard's injuries. He proposed that the areas with lighter injuries were handled externally, lessening the strain on the divine spell and allowing him to expend some effort after casting it to check if there were any other repercussions. Soon enough, Richard returned to his own room. The butler believed Richard, who had gone through shock, needed to get a good rest. Richard did appear tired as well, though that was because he had used eruption twice in succession. His injuries had mostly healed, and the areas where the skin had broken had ointment applied on them. His internal organs had obviously been shaken up, but after a few days he would completely recover. The cleric had spent the most time on his head. He hadn't actually felt uncomfortable at the start, but after being fiddled with for so long, he had begun to feel slightly dizzy. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 89. Punishment. Richard now sat alone by his bedside, his hands cradling his forehead. The events which had just transpired replayed in his mind scene by scene, every instant incomparably clear. Things had just happened far too suddenly. He had only felt a distinct sense of danger at the beginning, which was why he'd grown furious when those guards attacked him. He had chosen to retaliate with full strength, mercilessly crippling two of them, but he'd fallen with that attack from the third. This was a result that Richard had anticipated already. He was not arrogant enough to think that he could win against the joint attack of 3 warriors above level 8. That he was able to take 2 of them down with him was already an unexpected result. While this was only his first time experiencing a situation like this, Richard knew that it concerned the reputation of the Archerons. Tiny issues like it weren't common in Faust, but they weren't exactly rare either. Every family that successfully entered and established itself in Faust normally had some form of animosity with the older and more powerful families already present there. Thus, Richard was prepared for humiliation. Falk stepping on his head was one form of such, although it was an extreme kind that would create a blood feud. However, in the next moment everything had changed. When he thought back to it, the force coming from Falk's foot had been great enough to crush his head, smashing his skull into pieces like porcelain. In that moment, a true shadow of death had shrouded all of his senses. Falk had wanted to kill him. This wasn't a heated decision, but instead premeditated murder. Richard had never felt such a close shave with death before. That one attack from Blood Parrot had been fast and silent, not giving him even a chance to feel afraid. This time, things had been different. The terrifying pressure from that shoe, and the creaking of his skull under the force. It replayed itself clearly in his mind, time and time again. His ice-cold hands were trembling without end, and he felt so weak he could lose his consciousness in the next moment, sinking into boundless darkness. He felt bursts of pain from his fingers, a result of clobbering a level 8 warrior with his fists using no technique. His joints were still swollen up, and he was sweating from the pain. However, Richard was thankful for the pain. It was what allowed him to remain sober. The great amount of sweat soaking his clothing made it stick tight to his skin, but the discomfort only kept him clear. If not for Alice and Goliath appearing suddenly, if that foot had stomped all the way down. Richard couldn't stop himself from thinking of that over and over again. He wanted to control himself, but could not suppress the terror in his heart. Once the fury and humiliation had vanished, all that was left was a fear of death. It was a huge terror that Richard had never even imagined before. He looked up, forcing himself to see everything in the room, observing it attentively to expel the fear. Precision had grown erratic, however, with countless numbers appearing in his vision. Try as he might, he couldn't make any sense of them, as if his mind had been sealed in ice. It was only when that strange blade appeared in his vision that Richard's heart leapt slightly. His residence wasn't large, only containing a hall and 2 rooms. The bedroom was about 10 or so meters long, so the blade that was 1.5 meters long took up quite a large amount of space already. Without a scabbard, it was wrapped up crudely in beast skin and placed horizontally on the writing desk by his window. A corner of the skin had opened up, revealing a bit of the sharp blade within. Richard's heart thumped. As if enchanted, he jumped out of bed and slowly headed to the writing desk, grabbing the shaft and removing the beast skin that was wrapped around the blade. He then closed his eyes, breathing slow and deep. This was an ancient longsword, shaped to support stabs. The threads at the shaft were showing wear and tear, but it felt extremely comfortable to hold. In just a breath's time, Richard's mind spread through the handle and to the blade, his silver moon blood beginning to flow as it absorbed the moon force from the sky and poured it into the blade. It gave the blade some color that fluctuated with the moon force, changing irregularly with the colors of the moons. It was only then that Richard's mind began to steady itself, the blade in his hand making him feel like he had some power to depend on. He still couldn't help recalling the scene near the church, but things were different now. He was now simulating the course of events had he had this long sword in hand during the fight. The sword would have allowed him to draw enough power from the moons at the first inkling of danger, and with the added power from eruption his battle might would have increased threefold. He would be able to kill most of the guards and young nobles on the scene by the time it took a feather to drop, and the destructive power of the ashen indigo moon would leave Fawkes seriously injured. Only when he was truly near death, coming into contact with the Reaper's scythe, did Richard truly understand terror and the importance of power. If nobody had been able to stop Falk, who cared whether the Arcaran family would pursue the matter and the Joseph family would have no choice but to execute Falk? He would already be dead, and the dead couldn't fulfill any wishes or dreams. His thoughts finally calmed down, and everything before his eyes returned to normal. Richard let loose a long sigh and slowly placed the sword down. He then took a seat by the window, beginning to think over his experience that day. Numerous suspicious events began to link together one by one, and he had the jarring feeling that something was wrong. It was only then that he realized he knew far too little about his own family and the world outside, with no way for him to link everything together logically. Fatigue finally got to his weakened body and mind, and he couldn't help but lean against the desk and fall deep asleep. Some time later, a little bronze bell magically began to ring within the room, awakening Richard from his dreams. He rubbed his eyes in a daze, finding that it was already night. The room was already pitch black, with only a small area lit up by the moonlight coming through the window. The bronze bell continued to sound, and was followed by a gentle knock on his door. Richard opened it to find his butler, but instead of dinner he was brought to the basement of the castle's keep to participate in an internal trial of the family. A short while later, a bewildered Richard followed the butler to a floor underneath the castle's main tower. The corridors here were different from the damp and dark of the castle, instead being dry and stuffy. Passing through a large gate guarded by two fully armed foot soldiers, Richard was brought into an underground hall of considerable scale. This hall was hundreds of square meters large, and 2 floors tall. The walls were made of rock, and had a few dark red flags hung on them that could be considered decorations. At the end of the hall was a platform with 5 chairs. Gatton was seated in the middle, with Goliath and Alice in order on his right. On his left was an aged mage, followed by an icy middle-aged man dressed in black leather armor. Lined at the 2 sides of the hall against the wall were many other Arcarans, and he recognized a few youths that he'd seen on the day of the banquet. Richard headed to the sides, standing amongst the crowd. The 2 large wooden doors with iron embedded in them slowly closed, and with a desolate and distant sound of a bell a corner gate was opened in the hall. A bare-chested, boorish-looking warrior carried Warren and walked to the middle of the hall. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 90. Punishment. What are you doing? Bastard, get your hands off me. I am Gatton's son, the son of the family head. What right do you have to treat me like this? Are you trying to revolt? Warren exclaimed at the top of his voice along the way, and resisted with all his might, but the warrior managed to carry him with the ease of carrying a little chick. His eyes were covered by a piece of black cloth, and he couldn't see what was going on around him. And while there was a fair number of people around in the hall, nobody made a noise. He seemed to sense something when he was brought to the center of the hall, suddenly stopping his shouts as he involuntarily began to tremble. Gatton nodded towards the warrior, and he took off Warren's blindfold. The sudden, piercing brightness forced Warren to close his eyes. Only after a long time did he manage to see what was going on in the hall. He immediately realized that this was a trial, and he began trembling even more violently to the point that he couldn't even stand up straight. Only with the warrior behind him supporting his weight did he not collapse to the ground. After seeing the state Warren was in, the old man and middle-aged man on Gatton's left shook their heads, expressions turning cold. Warren suddenly shouted, "Father, what's going on? Why did they suddenly apprehend me? Save me!" Near the end, his shouts turned into wails, and he did all he could to run towards Gatton. However, the large hands of the warrior behind him were like iron, and he had no way to struggle free. Gatton originally looked calm, with his expression deadpan, but now he began to stroke his short mustache with a smile. Only those familiar with the man would be aware that this was when he was at his scariest. He made a small hand gesture and the warrior cupped Warren's mouth, disallowing him from making any more sounds. When things got slightly quieter in the hall, he looked to the left and right. "Warren is here now. What are your opinions?" Goliath sneered and said, "That half-legendary ring is ironclad proof. Do you still need to ask me about this?" Alice nodded as well, saying coldly, "There's too much evidence." "Guilty," the old mage said. "Guilty," said the middle-aged man as well. Warren suddenly began to struggle with all his might, wanting to say something, but could not release himself from the hold of the warrior behind him no matter what he did. In a moment of desperation, he even bit at the warrior's palm, but it was as if he was biting at elephant skin. Not only did he leave no traces behind, he almost lost his own teeth. Gatton nodded and then said calmly and imposingly, "Fine. There is enough evidence to prove that Warren colluded with Raymond Joseph and attempted to murder Richard R. Sharon, causing Knight Senma, who was in charge of his protection, to end up gravely injured in a risky circumstance. Since Richard was determined to be a core member of the family by the elders, Warren's punishment will be immediate execution." Warren's struggling suddenly ceased, and as if all the strength in his body had been sapped out, he slumped down. If not for the warrior still holding onto him, he would have completely crumpled to the ground. "No!" A piercing scream sounded from amidst the crowd, and an absolutely stunning young woman darted to the center of the hall, embracing Warren tightly. She did her best to shove at the warrior and save Warren, but no matter how she kicked, hit, or bit him, he remained unmoving like a rock. The woman was only level 3 or 4 at best, and that was far too little for her to cause any damage to him. The woman finally realized her actions against the warrior were in vain, and instead turned to yell at Gatton, "Richard is your son, but Warren isn't? My Warren grew up by your side, but what about that bastard that just suddenly showed up from the mountains? Besides, isn't he still alive and standing there well? Why are you executing Warren?" Gatton frowned and answered calmly, "This is a meeting of the Sharon family. You may be one of my women, Jade, but you have no right to speak here. And while I'm not in our family lands very often, don't assume I don't know how you've raised him. If not for you, he wouldn't have such guts." Jade suddenly jumped up, roaring at Gatton like a lioness, "So what if it's me? I want him to crawl towards the top and get the most power in the family and beat down all the people in his way. Gatton, don't think I don't know that the reason you wanted me was because I'm a half-elf, and look slightly similar to that elf who's always in your thoughts. I know Richard is her child, which is why you're killing my Warren for this little bastard." Gatton chuckled and nearly said, "Jade, don't forget yourself. You don't have the right to speak here, Dot." The old mage at Gatton's left lightly waved, and a muting spell was tossed towards Jade, resulting in her voice immediately vanishing. 2 warriors charged out and forcefully dragged her to a corner. However, she continued to struggle as if she had gone crazy. While the muting spell made it such that she could not make a sound, heartbreaking cries seemed to resound in the hall. Goliath stared at Gatton, and let loose a booming chuckle that made him seem like a man-eating beast. "Gatton, this woman of yours really is very gutsy. What's the punishment for interrupting a family trial?" My brain hasn't been serving me too well lately. Gatton turned ashen and made a sound, 10 lashes. Alice, you do it. Alice had no intentions whatsoever of rejecting this. She stood up and took a leather whip from a bare-chested warrior, drawing it back slightly with her wrists before cracking it a few times in quick succession. The whip was like a toxic dragon as it struck Jade's body, tearing her clothing up and leaving a bloody welt on her skin. Jade suddenly gasped, and her body went stiff before she began to tremble vigorously. The whip continued to crack, hitting her body with a consistent strength. The half-elf had fainted long before the 10th, and once it was done, Gatton waved for 2 warriors to drag her out of the trial hall. Gatton watched Warren and then took a look around, before speaking in a low voice sternly, "While us Arcarans have never been united, nor do we promote unity, true Arcarans will not harm each other. This is a tradition passed down from the ancestors, and nobody can defy it, not even my own son. In Faust, in Norland, in the numerous planes, we have never had a lack of enemies, which is why there is no need for enemies within our midst. If anyone else wishes to go against this principle, then let this be an example." Gatton raised his right hand, lay it flat, and pressed it down. The warrior in the center of the hall raised Warren, the muscles all over his body twisting as he then lightly knocked the middle of Warren's back with a fist. His body went completely stiff, eyes as wide as they could ever get, and his throat moved, but he could not make a sound. His body shook a few times, and he then crumpled to the ground, the luster in his eyes rapidly dissipating. As he watched the life seep out of Warren's body, Richard could not describe how he was feeling. It definitely wasn't sympathy or pity, no, all his suspicions and the abnormalities he'd noticed linked together in that moment. It was no wonder that Warren still wanted to provoke Falk despite his lack of battle might. No wonder that Senma was seriously injured, no wonder that the duel had actually been premeditated murder. Richard had no pity or sympathy for this boy who wanted to kill him, no. If Warren hadn't died today, then someday in the future he would have made sure to force him into a dead end. No, what Richard paid attention to was Jade's words. Her description of Gatton confused him greatly. Was she speaking the truth? Had Gatton lived all these years with a certain elf in his heart? If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 91. The Cornerstone of Heroes. News of the trial within the Arcaran family quickly spread out to Faust's nobility. Some were shocked by the news, while others were left deep in thought. In a private library within the Joseph Castle on the 6th island of the 6th layer, Raymond was in a rare state of deep thought as he listened to a report on the trial. After a long time, he turned to Valen. Gatton isn't just disciplining his family with this, he's also telling all the nobles of Faust that this matter isn't done yet. His own son is dead, but Falk is still alive. Valen fell silent, a grave expression on his face. With their assassination attempt failed, it didn't seem like the Arcarans had suffered any losses. In fact, they managed to cripple Falk and several youths from their subordinate families as well. Although those other youths weren't from the 14, they were still children of nobles who'd settled down permanently in Faust proper. Even Earl Goliath had to bear an entire week of suspicion and inquiry for that, although Gatton was also a member of the assembly, being in the 7th layer only gave one the power to vote, not veto. Alas, the matter was fated to reach no conclusion. The Sacred Alliance Assembly was just that, a place where the members of the Alliance met to discuss affairs. Whether the results of the votes were executed depended on the checks and balances of the various powers behind the scenes. An earl as tyrannical as Goliath couldn't possibly be sentenced to anything severe just for harming a few noble children. Besides, even though the public was allowed to sit in at the assemblies, only the 14 families actually possessed official seats. The members of these families at least knew everything, including inside information about the issue with Falk. The week spent on making things difficult for Goliath was simply to help the average families feel better about themselves and keep their reputations intact after he hurt their children. Without any major infighting in the alliance right now, some covering up was necessary. Still, Not only was Gatton able to find evidence against Warren immediately, he'd also called for an internal trial on the same night and executed Warren in front of the entire family. It was impossible for a trial of such scale to be kept secret, but it wasn't like he wanted it hushed anyway. The conclusion now would be that, since Gatton had lost a son, Duke Joseph had to as well. However, that son could not be Falk. On the other hand, he'd also transmitted a clear message to all the nobles of Faust. Richard Arcaran was the one person that was completely off limits. Anyone who even wanted to touch him had to be prepared to face a war with all the Arcarans. Valen stood up, responding solemnly, "Young master, the status of Richard in the Arcaran family is much greater than we had anticipated." This time around, Gatton even directly declared that he is one of the core members of the family, though he hasn't even made a real rune knight yet. There must be some inside news that we did not get. I think we have to prepare for war. Raymond sighed, feeling helpless. The war between us and the Arcarans never stopped. However, this means that we can't attack Richard in Faust anymore. If we do something like this again, then that's a provocation not to the Arcarans but to bloodthirsty Philip himself. Master Valen, you need to make some preparations. We need to move to the Mason Plain as quickly as possible. The war there needs to be ended quickly so we can free up our elites. We have a troop stationed in the family territory already, but we need to increase our vigor in espionage. I need information on Gatton's privately owned planes so that we can attack as soon as circumstances permit. Valen nodded, assuring him, "Don't worry too much, young master. The Arcarans have Richard, but that can only bring everything back to square one. Aren't you a rune master yourself, Dot?" Raymond shook his head. "I can't produce compound runes of that quality yet. My rune crafting is definitely inferior to his. But young master, Richard definitely can't compare to you in knowledge, and leadership, and governance. You are the hero who will bring the Josephs to the 5th layer." "Hero?" Raymond laughed mockingly. "With a body as weak and frail as mine, how can I become any heroic character? I doubt I'll be able to cross level 5 as a warrior in my lifetime." A faint look of sorrow fled across Valen's face. "But you still have the gift of magic. It is a great feat to be a level 12 mage at your age, and you're a scholar of Sorenberg on top." "You're not wrong." Raymond burst out laughing, as if his world had suddenly filled with sunshine. Though Valen was smiling along with his master, he knew in his heart that what Raymond lacked the most was time. If he couldn't break through as a warrior, he had less than 20 years left to live. 20 years was but the blink of an eye in the planar wars. But with the innate flaws in his physique, it would be a miracle for Raymond to achieve any such thing. In the endless planar wars, with the chaotic and turbulent times, the one cornerstone for a hero to rise was mere survival. Be it in reality or the void, the 5th layer was always up high in Faust. The islands were far above the level of the city proper, the highest points of their orbits almost reaching the Church of the Eternal Dragon. It would take more than a century to push the Josephs to the 5th layer. Compared to all of history, 20 years was as insignificant as a small flower in a long river. There wasn't much land even on the 4th island of the 5th layer, where the valiant emperor of the Sacred Alliance, bloodthirsty Philip, lived. At 1.5 kilometers in diameter, it was the biggest of the occupied islands, but it was still difficult to put something as magnificent and vast as the Sacred Alliance's imperial palace into such a small place. Despite prevalent use of spatial magic, a lot of the space needed for gardens had to be given up. The palace was built into the mountain itself, with the main hall sitting on the top, which had been flattened out manually. Every window, every balcony, and every pillar of this 17-story tall building was adorned with innumerable exquisite carvings. Individually, every part was rich in historical and artistic value, yet when piled together, they did not seem to be in harmony. When the pale golden light of dawn gradually filled the dining hall of the palace at breakfast, the long table was already filled with light refreshments and wine to whet the appetite. 10 maids stood by the side in attendance, carrying silver trays of food. Several court officials, dressed to the teeth and with wigs on, also stood by in preparation to report the happenings of the day before. A crisp and melodious bell started to chime in the breakfast hall, and a bird larger than a mountain falcon suspended from a copper stand on the ceiling started to chirp, "All hail the Emperor! All hail the Emperor!" A door on the other side of the hall opened, and a tall, strong-looking man walked in. He stood over 7 feet tall and had a curly blonde wig, his skin glowing like Faust's sunlight as well. A shiny flush radiated from his cheeks, which trembled as he walked, as well as his mustache that was shaped like a smile. A weaved satin top concealed a shockingly large belly, outlined in gold and secured with a wide golden belt. The belt was embedded with all sorts of gems. The buckle of the belt was even embellished with an Azhara star diamond. This jewel was precious enough to be included as a core component in a level 5 rune or legendary item, yet it was being used purely as a powerless ornament on this belt. This man, who was dressed so extravagantly it was almost amusing, was none other than the Supreme Emperor of the Sacred Alliance, bloodthirsty Philip. Moving his enormous body to the dining table, he barely managed to squeeze into a chair 3 times the average size with great effort. Panting roughly, he exclaimed, the chair became smaller again. "If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc. please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 92. Appetite Determines Power. A delicate-looking, lanky court official immediately bowed deeply, saying solemnly, "The chair is completely at fault. I'll have it replaced right away. As for this thing with the audacity to shrink, it'll be taken care of accordingly after it gets dragged away." Philip waved his enormous hand. "That's not necessary right now. Eating is what matters most, it can wait until I finish my meal." He held up a custom-made goblet, drinking about a bottle and a half's worth of aperitif in a single gulp. Then, with another brief wave, all 8 plates piled with appetizers were emptied into his bottomless pit of a mouth. The maids immediately rushed in, skillfully clearing the empty plates before serving the main course one dish after the other. Judging simply from their nimble movements, it was clear that they were knights or assassins of at least level 4 or 5. While a dining table which could hold 10 dishes at once may seem large, it merely appeared average in the Emperor's presence. They then removed the silver lids off the next set of plates, revealing enormous steaks so raw they were still flush with blood. The origin of this meat was unknown, and even those who'd served here for more than 3 years couldn't identify every type of meat. Although the edges of the plates were garnished with fresh flowers and a sauce, the steaks themselves were almost fully raw. Raw steak was the Emperor's favorite dish. Philip's eyes lit up. Before digging in, he threw a piece of ribeye steak mid-air, upon which that peculiar bird swooped down to catch the meal before taking it back to its own perch and pecking at it intently. The Emperor himself began to polish off kilograms of raw meat at an astonishing speed, one piece after the other. However, it was strangely quiet when he ate, with barely any sound of chewing coming from his mouth. This piece of dining etiquette was the closest the Emperor came to fulfilling any sort of aristocratic manners. As for the massive bones in the steaks, they silently disappeared down the Emperor's throat as if they were meat as well. Another court official cleared his throat, and began to recount the past happenings in the day in a melodious voice. It was mainly about an important event that took place while the Emperor was sleeping at night. The Grey Dwarves and their beast allies launched a sneak attack on the Thunder God's fort. Of course, they were fought off. As for your immediate territory of Monroe, the first round of taxes were just levied, with the total being. The Arcarans also held an internal trial last night. Wait. Philip swallowed a mouthful of meat with some difficulty. What were you saying just now? Gatton killed his own son, Warren? That's right. Philip put down his fork and knife for once, and thought for a while before saying, "Seems like that Richard is an interesting character. Gatton should intend to let him become the successor." What do you know about Richard? He's a personal apprentice of Sharon. What? The Emperor spat out a mouthful of unchewed meat in response. The court official was astonished as well. Yet, he waved his hand at once and maids flocked over to clear the mess on the table. At the same time, they passed down orders to the kitchen to prepare 10 more portions of the main dish. This instantaneous reaction was enough to show his capabilities as a court official. Philip coughed a little, spitting out another half-chewed bone before he breathed in. "Which Sharon are you talking about?" The court official replied carefully, "The Alliance Guardian." "You personally conferred the title upon her." The Emperor looked unsettled. He asked, "What has she been up to recently?" Information about the legendary mage was obviously a priority for them. The court official was ready, replying immediately, "I heard Her Excellency has been exploring planes a lot recently. It's been a long time since she returned to the deep blue." It was only then that the Emperor looked slightly more at ease. He stopped eating for once, and looked at the entire table of steak before he said ruefully, "Oh dear, this woman. When she came looking for me back then, she actually wanted to compete with me in terms of appetite. Your Majesty, you certainly claimed an overwhelming victory." The court official immediately said. This was not entirely flattery. The Emperor snorted, and said after a long time, "It was merely a small victory. No, in fact it was just a narrow one. Your Majesty, you are truly a noble ruler to be able to hold the legendary mage down." The court official pretended not to notice the Emperor's tone and continued to praise him relentlessly. It was merely good luck back then. If she were to come again now, the outcome of the competition may not be the same anymore. Never underestimate the legendary mage, even if it is just in terms of appetite. The Emperor chided. "Certainly. Of course." The court official repeatedly nodded in agreement. Philip waved his enormous hand and said, "How about this? You can go prepare a ton of dragon's rib steak later and give it to Richard in my name. Just say that these are extra meals for him. 1 ton of dragon's rib steak." The court official inhaled sharply in an exaggerated manner, and politely expressed his objection. "Isn't it a little too much for him to finish? We have less than 100 tons total in the kitchen." Philip impatiently waved his enormous hand. "Just do as I say. Appetite determines power. Don't tell me a young lad who caught Sharon's I can't even finish this bit of food? But there really isn't much stock left in the kitchen. Why don't you think of ways to buy first, and get General Garmel to lead men on a hunt for a few more dragons? I don't want green dragons, their meat is sour. He knows my taste." He then thought for a while before saying to the aged and thin Vice Minister of Financial Affairs who was on the other side, "Go to my treasury and see if there's any tools there that can be used for self-defense. Take 2 of them and give them to Richard, together with the steak. It doesn't have to be the best, as long as it is sufficient to make it clear that I am on their side. After all, Gatton is considered a member of royalty as well. We cannot let his new successor meet with any mishaps in Faust. Otherwise, those who create trouble for him should also need to pay a price for it. How should we deal with Falk, then?" The court official who came forward to report the matter inquired. "Leave it to those old folks from the assembly, we shall not meddle. Let the Josephs and Arcarans battle first." Richard discovered after the trial that people were looking at him differently now. The hostility and disdain had faded, and whenever he was out the increase in the number of people taking the initiative to greet him was obvious. And they were all more respectful than before as well. Additionally, he'd now been allocated a laboratory for his own use. He could craft elementary and grade 2 runes, performing experiments of a similar level as well. He was also assigned 2 assistants, and 3 people to help run errands. At the same time, Gatton had also delegated 4 young and rather powerful knights as a reference for Richard to study his own creation of rune knights. It was barely past lunchtime. Less than 2 hours since he'd been notified of the laboratory, Richard was already rushing towards the place. Magic held far greater of an attraction to him than the Arcaran surname. With how small the island was, the laboratory was a short walk from his residence. It was one of only 3, all built on the fringes of the island for the sake of safety, and was protected by 2 magic ballista towers. This way, the island was protected from external enemies. At the same time, in the event that an explosion took place in the laboratory, the extent of damage could also be minimized. The laboratory was a 3-story building that took up little space. The first floor was an administrative and leisure area, meant for the assistants and servants. The second was a storehouse for magic materials, while the third was his actual workplace. But as he set foot on the third level and entered the laboratory, Richard's brows creased together at once. Even with all 3 floors together, this place still wasn't as large as his laboratory in the deep blue. The sign engraved on a corner of the desk suggested that this was a product of dwarven make, built with refined gold about 30 years ago. As far as normal magic laboratories went, this place was above average. However, the one Richard had been using in the deep blue had been designed exclusively 300 years ago, by a now extinct dwarven kingdom. There were few of its kind in the world. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 93. Unexpected Offering. The other equipment in the laboratory was similar to what he had in his own, but even they were still at least 3 grades lower in quality. Just the work desk alone from the deep blue was worth more than all the 3 laboratories of this island combined. 2 assistants, a man and woman both over the age of 20, were already prepared in the laboratory. The man was a level 8 mage, while the woman a level 10. As Richard walked in, they were carefully cleaning all the apparatus in the place alongside a teenage girl. Looking at her from behind, Richard found this girl vaguely familiar. When she turned around, it gave him a huge shock. Coco. The last time Richard had seen Coco was when he'd attended the banquet to select a partner. The lights were dim that night, and her demure and elegant demeanor against that romantic volcanic backdrop had left an impression in his mind. However, he'd completely forgotten about her after the banquet. In terms of leaving an impression, she could not compare to Demi or Venica. Seeing Coco here once more surprised Richard. It seemed to suggest that Coco's father wasn't able to support her well. The Arcarans did provide some resources to the youths sent to the island, but those resources came largely in the form of free training, and didn't give much for one's day-to-day life. Even though Faust was cheaper than the Deep Blue, it was still more expensive than the rest of the Alliance. The Deep Blue's wares were extravagantly priced because they sold high-end products, with everything able to be described as luxurious goods. On the other hand, even basic necessities like food or clothing were priced unreasonably in Faust. But then again, Faust and the surrounding eternal plains weren't fertile enough for agriculture to be a possibility. Any food had to be transported from far away to the top of the mountain, making just the transportation fee exorbitant. And this wasn't even considering other expenses. Coco seemed to grow rather anxious upon seeing Richard. She took a step back, as if to hide herself behind one of the assistants, but because of how small the laboratory was, she immediately bumped into a rack of potions. The 10 or so test tubes at the front of the rack swayed dangerously, and a few almost fell down. The female mage furrowed her brows, speaking sternly. Coco, why are you always so clumsy? You wouldn't be able to pay for those test tubes even if you wanted to. What if this happened when Master Richard was in the middle of an experiment? The family gave you a great chance to work here, so stop your vain attempts to amount to something greater. You'll never be able to rise through the ranks to become Master Richard's partner. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Coco's face was pale, as she bowed incessantly. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she forcefully held them back. Having been denounced by the female mage, she stuttered as she tried to explain. No. I never held those intentions, really. Are you sure? Ha! The female mage mocked, while the male mage furrowed his brows and remained quiet as well. Richard was undoubtedly the most eligible bachelor in the Arcaran family, the target of even highly sought-after girls like Demi and Venica. While bloodline was the most important factor, Richard's talent, future prospects, and stellar appearance were other important reasons. After the night of the trial, the news of him becoming a core member of the family had already been spread around, signifying his entrance into the hierarchy of the family's power. Perhaps it was a bit too premature to talk about the powers he possessed yet, but Richard was only 15 years old, and everything had just begun. As for Coco, she could neither choose nor reject a partner for herself. Hence, the two assistants thought that her statement about not having any such thoughts were extremely fake. Any Arcaran who chose to come to the floating island had very obvious intentions. In Norland, one's strength came from their physical body, while their demeanor originated from factors ranging from one's bloodline, family background, education, cultivation, and one's personal abilities. A woman's worth was the sum of all of the factors above. Those like Coco, who had personal attributes such as an exquisite appearance and an elegant demeanor, were a dime a dozen. In the large-scale slave markets, one would be able to easily find half-elf teenage girls that would rival Coco's appearance and elegance. Furthermore, Coco's weak physique and her current status as a level 2 illusionist suggested she had no talent to speak of. As such, it was practically impossible for her to become a woman of standing. If she couldn't even cast a level 2 illusion, how would she possess any semblance of rich magic and refined knowledge? Even if she were to memorize everything, she would be at a disadvantage compared to powerful mages who had intellectual capabilities common people could only dream of. As for artistic abilities, who cared? The assistants would still be able to accept Coco being inept at the job. However, her defensive attitude had crossed their bottom line. It seemed the girl herself realized this, however, so she stopped trying to explain herself. She instead lowered her head and placed herself at the mercy of the female mage, allowing the woman to berate her. Only this time, the tears that she was fighting hard to control eventually slid down her face, one after another. This job was very important to Coco, which explained why she did not rebut the female mage nor leave without a word even though the woman wasn't mincing her words. In a place like Norland, where the difference in status and power was pronounced, walking away from such a situation wouldn't just lead to one losing their job. Richard furrowed his brows and tried to defuse the situation. Alright, end it here. We didn't lose anything anyway. I'll be starting an experiment, so please just set up the work table. The man began to inject mana into the table, while Richard passed a list he'd prepared before this for the female mage to get from the warehouse. While waiting for the table to be ready, he had Coco, who was about to leave, to bring over an inventory of the materials in the warehouse. When she handed him a thin notebook and was about to leave again, he gave her a list of apparatus that he had written to prepare for later use. Coco looked at Richard with a confused expression, before nodding her head vigorously as she conscientiously went on to do her work. She too knew that this was an alternate form of protection. If she did whatever Richard told her to, she would naturally be allocated more work to do. In places like these, many would jump at the chance of doing more work, actually fearing a lack. In brief, she would not be asked to leave the laboratory for no good reason. As the female mage prepared the materials, Richard read the store checklist and let out a huge sigh. The quality of the materials in the Arcaran warehouse was a far cry from that in the Deep Blue, and even the quantities couldn't match up. He saw barely any grade 2 materials in the list, forget grade 3 or 4. Materials in Norland were classified the same way as runes. A rune of a particular grade would require its core materials to be of that grade. Looking at what he had on hand, Richard realized that there weren't enough resources to craft even many standard runes here, forget the incomplete custom designs he had. Resource-wise, the Arcarans had to be the poorest of the 14 families of Faust, not comparable even to the minor nobles who didn't even have their own islands. At this moment, he thought back to the first words Steelrock had said about them: they're poor. The second thought that flashed across Richard's mind was the rune materials Wennington had passed to him a few days ago. It appeared as if those materials couldn't be from the Arcaran warehouse. However, Richard did not put too much thought to it, and quickly tossed the thought to the back of his head. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 94. Unexpected offering. Richard flipped through the few pages at the back of the list, looking at the pitiful amount of grade 2 materials in the family, and shook his head helplessly. For the first time in his life, he found himself needing to carefully plan his ingredients. He already had a rune knight model in mind, but without the proper materials he would have to stop that halfway through. He wanted to match a custom-designed eruption rune with 2 elementary strength runes and a vitality rune, giving the Mount a dash rune that was again a custom design. This sort of rune knight would possess terrifying instant offense, giving them a 150% boost to their offensive power when eruption combined with the strength runes. Vitality would boost their endurance in compensation, shortening the time they needed to rest after battle. The core of this plan would be the 3 runes he'd designed himself. After rethinking the quantity and scope of the materials he could use, Richard had no choice but to give up on all non-standard. However, he made a new list, writing out 10 or so materials that would raise the effects of the standard runes and handed it to the female mage to purchase. He'd inquired already, knowing that there was still some money left over from the construction of the laboratory, so as long as he spent within a certain limit he didn't need to apply for money from the family. With all arrangements in order, Richard used the materials he already had at hand and began crafting a rune. Once immersed in the world of magic, Richard temporarily forgot all the worries in the world. As had been his habit in the past, he did everything from scratch. He'd already decided to create his first batch of rune knights all by himself, including preparing the materials. One by one, the materials were refined. It was as if the complicated procedures were carved into Richard's mind, and there was no need to check any notes or books whatsoever. A thick, large, and heavy piece of magic beast hide was carved into 3 pieces, his hands extremely steady as he used the knife. One could see practically no difference in the thicknesses of the 3 pieces if they looked with the naked eye. As he drew the magic formation, Richard was like the most precise of dwarven gold smelting machines, working for hours on end without the slightest of mistakes. Lines flowed from the tip of the magic pen, each curve not one whit different from the standard design. Every time Richard began drawing the magic formation, the 2 assistants could not help but halt their breathing, afraid to make any sound and unwilling to let any detail escape their eyes. Never in their dreams did they think that the magic formations that existed as standard pictures in their books could be replicated before their eyes with not a single difference. Was this the world of rune masters? They tried to remember every move of his, every detail, all the steps while preparing the materials, and every hand gesture. This was their greatest benefit as assistants, they could observe the experiments of a rune master at close proximity. Now, they could learn all about Richard's methods and his secrets. Even if they didn't have the talent for runecrafting themselves, an improved ability to draw magic formations would still be very beneficial to them. If they could just learn some procedures that only needed practice to master, the scope of their careers would increase greatly. With every section that Richard finished, he would take a rest. The time he took to make each section varied between an hour and 3, but when Richard rested, he would always find that his 2 helpers looked more tired than he was. Studying also sapped at one's physical strength. When Richard was refreshed once more, they still looked pale and unsteady on their feet. With his vitality rune equipped, the speed of his recovery was several times higher than that of these 2 mages. This way, the 2 helpers actually weren't doing much, while Coco helped with passing the materials or tools over at the side. Under Richard's guidance, she even successfully washed an intermediate equipment and did all the assistants' work. This time, the female mage did not scold her, because she could spend all her energy on learning and pass on all the miscellaneous work to the girl. 4 days later, an elementary strength rune was completed, the pace having left the 2 assistants dumbstruck. After using a specially made box to store the rune, Coco, who was standing by the side, passed a piece of paper over. In neat and clean writing, the total sum based on market prices of all the materials used in the creation of the rune were listed out in a detailed manner, including the quantity used. This was a record Richard wanted her to make at the same time, and this paper indicated how diligent and attentive she was. At the bottom of the paper was the total sum of all the materials, in other words the costs of the materials of the rune, which came to 17,200 gold coins. This came as a surprise to Richard, and he smiled at Coco, while she secretly stuck her tongue out. She obviously knew the average price of an elementary rune, which was why the total cost was a huge surprise to her as well. Of course, this was merely the costs of the materials. If one wanted to go into the details, then the pay of Coco and the assistants, the rent of the laboratory as well as wear and tear of equipment, and other costs would all add up. Lastly was another huge expense: Richard's time. Not putting his price into consideration, the cost of the rune was about 20,000. Due to the rate of failure, the average rune master would have a cost nearing 60,000. However, Richard was not satisfied with this rune. As he lacked some key ingredients, he could only make it based on the standard version, and the final amplification effect was exactly the same as the standard one at 30%. When put on the market, the price would be around 70 to 100,000 at most. While he was unsatisfied with the effects of the elementary strength rune, Richard could only continue, because this was all the materials he had. The materials he needed to improve this were not something he could purchase in the near future. Price was secondary. Many materials, such as flame-striped stones, were often out of stock due to multiple uses and low supply. One could only exchange for them with families that had mines in their territory. The new model Richard had decided to use was a traditional jack-of-all-trades, with 1 strength rune, 2 defense runes, an agility rune and a powered-up mount. Such knights were useful on any battlefield, but in exchange they couldn't exactly turn the tides of as many. Using them well would require wisdom from the commander. The total cost of a knight's rune would be about 100,000 gold coins, and that of the armor, weapons and mount was at about 20,000 gold coins. However, this did not include the energy and value of Richard's time. Richard was extremely proficient in these standard runes, which was why when he began the 2nd strength rune, he was soon immersed in the world of magic again. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 95. Unexpected Offering. Flo Bay was glowing in its summer beauty. The Grand Mages of the Deep Blue had all met up as usual in Sharon's public meeting hall, about to discuss the operations of the Deep Blue for the following month. From the French window here, one could take in the entire beauty of Flo Bay. All of them looked relaxed, black gold included. While they hadn't had the extra income from Richard's runes in the past year or so, the amount of Sharon's delight they'd given out had also decreased in turn. The Grey Dwarf quite liked this situation, because the financial condition was much more stable and easier to predict. Anyone working in finance hated uncertainty in either direction. It didn't take a long time for the discussion to come to a conclusion. The mages all completed their arrangements for July and August, falling into some rare idle chatter. Sharon hadn't participated this time, but there was no need for her regular presence anyway. The Grand Mages could take care of most of the work, and the legendary mage's whereabouts were often unpredictable. After the blow from Mountainsea, she'd been gone for months at a time to the endless plains to earn money. While it had been 2 years, the effects had yet to completely disappear. Now, for instance, the Grand Mages had not seen Sharon for nearly 3 months, and nobody knew how long she would wander the various plains before her return. In the past, there was often more joy than worry when Sharon returned. Recently, however, the Grand Mages learned from her words that the places she went to were quickly diminishing in profits. With the strength of her dragon-repelling aura increasing with each expedition, the difficulty in capturing greater dragons increased as well. With the dragons now able to sense her arrival from 100 kilometers away, they would immediately flee. Even the legendary mage found it hard to make up for that distance. In fact, more mature and powerful dragons even had the time to pack up their most precious treasures before taking off. Just as the Grand Mages were relaxedly enjoying the great afternoon sunshine, a violent magic undulation ripped through the hall. Chaotic elemental particles spread in all directions, repelling and charging into each other as the hall was quickly enveloped by a small storm. The mana in the Grand Mages began to stir, and with it being so unexpected, the protective magics of the Grand Mages were completely ineffective as the storm caused them to sway everywhere. Just as all the shocked mages did their best to control the chaotic magic, an exceedingly terrifying, berserk aura descended upon the place, leaving them all without the ability to even move or think. This pressure came from a disparity of strength, similar to a dragon's aura with regular humans. However, to be able to completely pressure them even with an elemental storm here, this was a strength that far surpassed even the legendary mage. While everyone was overwhelmed with shock, a teleportation gate suddenly opened at the center, and a snow-white and satiny thigh peeked out amidst the brilliant rays of magic. But then, as if pulled by an invisible hand, it was forced back into the gate. The abrupt change, with the large gap between the terrifying aura and snow-white thigh, immediately caused the Grand Mage's thoughts to short-circuit for a moment. The portal closed for a moment, gone as quickly as it opened, but just as it seemed to disappear it shone brightly all of a sudden, spitting out mottled light like it was a fountain. Asterisk whoosh, asterisk, the familiar figure of the legendary mage charged out of the portal. She turned around in midair the moment she was out, shooting out a dazzling ray of light that slammed into the gate. The teleportation gate flickered violently, to the point that the space around it was showing signs of twisting, but it did not shrink as the legendary mage had anticipated. Instead, it increased in size a few times, to the point that it nearly filled up the space in the tremendous hall. The leaping rays of magic dimmed till it was almost impossible to see, and the raging waves of corrosive hot air occupied everyone's senses. An enormous demon head peeked out of the gate, its sharp horn rubbing against the edges as if this wasn't a portal made of magic but a solid body. Numerous sparks flew out, and the sound of metal crashing against metal rang within the hall. The most striking thing on the head was the terrifying large mouth with fierce teeth all over, large enough to swallow all of the Grand Mages a short distance away. There were 10 or so forked tongues within, coiled together like snakes. They reached out over 10 meters far, practically licking Sharon's fingers. This boundless and deep aura that could stimulate the fear in the depths of a race made it clear to the Grand Mages that this great demon had a rank that far exceeded their knowledge. When the front half of the demon's head peeked out of the teleportation gate, the pressure had left the Grand Mages paralyzed on the ground. The little bit of mana they had somehow been able to gather dissipated instantly, and the raging elements in the hall had long since gone quiet except for a portion that was timidly coiled at the legendary mage's side. The demon did its best to peek further in, but with the legendary mage controlling it, the teleportation gate finally began to slowly shrink. Failing when success was in sight, the demon descended into fury. Its large mouth opened and closed as it roared loudly, "Sharon, don't let me see you in the abyss again." The legendary mage hummed and valiantly gestured her middle finger at the demon. "I've already heard this twice from you, but..." The pulling force from the other side of the gate immediately strengthened, and the time of activation of the channel between planes reached its limit. The enraged great demon was forcefully sent back to the abyss, and the teleportation gate then completely closed off. However, the aura of flames and rot still pervaded the air, leaving proof of the connection with the abyss just then. Due to the shock of the pressure from the demon, the minds of the Grand Mages were still half frozen. It took them a moment to recover, and in this period of time the one thing that stuck in their minds was that middle finger from the legendary mage. The Grand Mages struggled to get up one after another, and only then did they notice how terrible the legendary mage looked. She seemed to be even worse off than they were. A part of her long hair had been singed, and her blue legendary magic robes were damaged everywhere. Her skirt was practically torn into rags, revealing more than half of her snow-white thighs. Signs of burns could be seen everywhere on her skin. The Grand Mages that had followed her after the Deep Blue became peaceful had never seen her so pathetic before, and it was obvious it had been a difficult battle in the abyss. 2 Grand Mages that had entered Deep Blue 60 years ago recalled ruefully, finding that they had seen her this terrible only during the 3rd expansion of Deep Blue. At that time, they had merely been young level 12 or 13 mages, while Sharon herself was only level 16. Most of their memories of then were of war and smoke. Dwarves, orcs, were-beasts, and draconians had allied to attack the Deep Blue one after the other, but had been defeated again and again. The Grey Dwarves did not know magic, but amongst the orcs were many shamans and mages. While the draconians had the smallest numbers, they were known for their great battle might and powerful spells. At that point, Sharon often fought with countless enemies in the vast Everwinter Mountains, and when she returned to the Deep Blue, this was often the state she was in. However, at that time, regardless of what kind of dangers there had been, she was always beautiful and refined, and her eyes were as bright as they were now. At level 16, Sharon had once left the Draconian Grand Mages fleeing ignominiously. The two Grand Mages had then fought by her side, pursuing one for nearly 1,000 kilometers. They had obtained countless valuable experiences in battle, and understood many secrets of magic. After Sharon officially became a Grand Mage, it was rare to see her fighting this hard. Once she became a legendary being, the Deep Blue had become a forbidden area for many races in the north of the continent. Having to bear witness to Sharon fighting that hard again naturally left them shocked. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 96. Unexpected Offering. Your Excellency, was that? Fair had already guessed who the demon was from its characteristics and power, but he couldn't manage to say it out loud. Sharon groaned and blurted indifferently, Burman Gogon, a greater demon lord from the abyss. That fellow is too narrow-minded. All I did was kill a lesser lord from his level and he chased me for more than a month. Humph, he didn't even manage to catch me in the end and I sent him back. Ha ha ha. The legendary mage became more excited as she continued, and she ended up bragging about herself with her classical laughter as a finale. Yet, all the Grand Mages could not hide their astonishment, and they did not feel that Sharon was being sarcastic at all. Rather, they could say that she was being modest. Even Fair had thought that was at most a lesser demon lord, not expecting it to be a greater one who ruled an entire level of the abyss. Sharon had even killed a lesser lord. After laughing hard, Sharon, who had finally cheered up, was reminded of something that she was holding onto on her right hand. She then threw that lump of meat, which was still moving and bleeding, to Fair, saying, "Seal this up immediately, and send it to that fellow Gatton right away." Right, use the teleportation array to do it. Don't worry about spending, Gatton will be responsible for these wear and tear costs. Do it quick, this thing is perishable. The moment he received the meat lump, Fair took 2 steps back to stabilize himself. Although the lump of meat was not big, it was extraordinarily heavy, as though it had the same weight as a crystal of equal volume. It was still wriggling rhythmically, and the wild and confusing odor it emitted made Fair really frightened. He almost couldn't get a hold of it, and the others around hurried to give him a hand. They carried the lump of meat together, running towards the teleportation array to send it off. On the other hand, the legendary mage started to change her clothes, shower, do some skin maintenance, and eat some fruit. She seemed to be busier than the other Grand Mages. Within 30 minutes, when Sharon was still lazing in the bathtub, a magical bell beside her rang melodiously and Fair's voice rang out, "Her Excellency, that object has been sent. Marquis Gatton wishes to have a word with you. What are your thoughts?" Sharon laughed gently and replied, "Since that fellow is not afraid to spend money, what's the big deal? Answer the call." "Yes." Fair's voice disappeared from the magical bell, and shortly after the bell radiated rays of light, casting a 3-dimensional image in the space in front of Sharon. She could see Gatton holding onto a black seal, his face ashen, staring into the box where the meat was still moving vigorously. As Sharon caressed her skin, not caring that half of her chest was exposed above the water, she said, "When did you become this indifferent with spending money? Even I feel the pain of spending on such a long-range communication spell. Since you are so rich, pay back those loans that you owe me." The other end of the magical projection was at the Archeron's Island, in an enclosed room in the basement of the family castle that could only be reached with magic. This basement was themed red and black, with a ceramic table that looked like an altar in the middle. On the altar was a burning flame, with a similar magical image above it from where one could hear Sharon's voice and the sound of splashing. However, the magical image on Gatton's side did not show the calm scene of Sharon taking a bath, but a projection of black gold instead. The projection of the Grey Dwarf was rotating continuously, tossing out a gold coin for every full turn that increased a number on the top right corner of the image once. Gatton, however, wasn't interested in the contents of the image. His gaze was fixed on the seal box, while his expression became worse. Very quickly, an angry voice sounded in that basement, "Your Excellency. You already know the Arcaran bloodline might have traces of demons, but you still send us a demon's heart. This is the second time. My dearest Sharon, can't you just take a detour and walk around in hell instead of the abyss? The devils there will definitely have what you need." A loud and beautiful laughter was emitted from the Grey Dwarf's body. "This is the heart of a lesser demon lord. Hee, Gatton, you have to be aware that it is not easy to find a greater demon lord of the abyss that cannot catch up to me. That is why I want to walk around in the higher levels. As for hell, I will end up there eventually, but it depends on my mood. You should know clearly that I might have a good mood if you clear your debts." The moment debts were mentioned, Gatton's confidence went down immediately. He groaned and closed the seal box, saying, "I look too lowly upon Richard. But this item cannot maintain its full magic power for long. I have to go to the Church of the Eternal Dragon to hold the ceremony tonight. I have many things to do. Do you have anything else to say? You don't plan to tell Richard about Elena, dot." "Elena," Gatton smiled bitterly and replied, "how can I tell him? Should I tell him that I was the one who executed his mother's family back then? That the reason she didn't want to come back to me was that hatred coming from the extermination of her nation? How could I tell him about that? Elena's death was my fault. Then are you going to just continue delaying it? What else can I do? Perhaps it'll be resolved one day." Sharon did not continue any longer, instead changing the topic. "Richard's mana is growing stronger now. When he passes level 10, the seal I cast on him back then will grow weaker. The nightmare creatures will be able to see him again, and although it'll be dim at the start, he'll continue to grow clearer and clearer in their world. When the seal completely disappears after 20 years, he will glow like a lighthouse in the dark, attracting countless nightmare creatures to Norland. Norland is a prime plane. The effect will be very obvious. You need to send him to a lesser plane to weaken the effect with the spatial distortions. Perhaps that will help stall for some more time." Gatton's expression changed, and he started pondering. Sharon let out a sigh. "Maybe we don't have to be so worried. Once the specific nightmare creature of that tribe is annihilated, the lighthouse in Richard's soul will naturally disappear as well. Alright, go on to prepare your ceremony soon. Teleportation array communication is very expensive. Black Gold will send you the bill shortly." Gatton nodded, but his expression remained the same. The nightmare creatures were a strange and mysterious race that wandered the plains. They could be small and weak, or extremely strong. Nobody had ever acquired enough details to understand them, nor did they know how large their population actually was. The flame on the altar was still burning, but the magical power within the flame had disappeared. The Grey Dwarf that was rotating above it had vanished too, leaving the moving flame that reflected Gatton's contrasting expressions. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 97. The Road at Night. Dusk was approaching, and Norland's second sun began to set in the west, the last of its brilliance dyeing the rivers, the horizon, and the entirety of Norland red. In the time it took to shut the arched gates, Faust was enveloped by a gentle, fragrant golden glow. It was as if the world stood still, and time passed in tranquility. Richard released his mana, the beast skin in front of him shining with layers of spell formations like a gentle breeze on a river. Another rune was now completed, and while the effects of it were barely better than the standard, he was extremely satisfied considering the materials used. He sat quietly and waited for the power of the spell formation to finish taking effect. Suddenly, a wave of fatigue swept past him, which caused him to feel drowsy. Every time this happened, Richard's first countermeasure was to gulp down a bottle of revitalizing potion. With one hand rubbing his temple, Richard's other hand reached for the side of the table. However, what greeted his hand was not the familiar, icy, smooth touch of the cylinder, but a warm and bouncy piece of flesh. What followed next was a startled gasp, as the piece of flesh hurriedly left his hand. Richard was flabbergasted, and he turned his head. He saw Coco standing a meter away with a flush on her cheeks. She was staring at him in shock, coupled with restrained anger. The piece of flesh that he had grabbed was her buttocks. Not bad to the touch, but not exceptional. This was the first thought that came to Richard's mind. Back in the Deep Blue, Richard always had a revitalizing potion by his side to drink when he was weary. However, the Arcarans could not provide such a good environment, and the few potions they had were saved for times of war. However, Richard had just recently left Deep Blue, so this habit of 5 years would not be that easy to forget. Maybe I should apologize to her? Richard pondered, not knowing how to explain himself. The two assistants were by his side, so it would be inappropriate of him to comment on the impoverishment of the Arcarans. Furthermore, Richard did not think that being poor was something wrong. Right now, he was extremely aware of the vast differences between the outside world and the Deep Blue. Take these two helpers, for example. In their lives they would rarely have seen more than a few powerful mana potions, so they would never be able to imagine sustaining one's daily tasks with such things. This was where the awkwardness lied. Richard wanted to tell the truth, but nobody would believe him. The female assistant only harumphed and turned away, not saying a single word. As for the male assistant, his gaze flitted and landed on Coco's buttocks briefly, before he shrugged his shoulders. As for Coco, her cheeks were still red. She bit on her lower lips, and her eyes seemed to glisten with tears. However, she too did not speak as she continued with her tasks of tidying and preparing the table, except that she now maintained a certain distance from Richard. In actuality, with the disparity in Richard's and Coco's identity, a brief touch of her buttocks was no big deal. Even if the person who touched her was the male assistant, he would at most be reprimanded lightly. If that happened, some might even consider that it was Coco's motive to bewitch the man. Richard knew of the many rules of the nobility, and knew that if he were to apologize now it would create trouble for Coco in the future. However, Coco was evidently livid, and her expression betrayed her intentions to stay at a distance away from him, something that caused him to feel rather uncomfortable. The hourglass was already halfway down, indicating that it was almost time for dinner. Seeing the many materials and apparatus set up on the table, Richard felt rather impatient. Soon, he tossed the equipment he held in his hand on the experiment table, before standing up and walking away. However, just as he took 2 steps forward, he felt something split apart deep in his consciousness, and an incomparably crisp clap sounded loudly before a sliver of iciness mixed with darkness appeared, as if a shadow dissipated in his consciousness. Richard was taken aback and immediately halted. He concentrated deep on his consciousness, yet could not find any traces of the shadow, as if what had happened was just an illusion. He scanned his body with his senses, but he did not discover anything amiss. However, there was a lingering trace of danger that remained. Something had happened, but he couldn't figure out what it was. At this moment, the thuds of heavy footsteps sounded in the corridor. Senma appeared at the 3rd floor of the laboratory, saying to Richard, "Master wants to see you, follow me." Richard nodded his head, and instructed the 2 assistants to keep the runes that he had just crafted before following Senma outside. Senma's face was still ashen, and the aura that emanated from her was rather weak. She took out an exquisite vial and tossed it to Richard. "Drink this along the way, you don't have much time left." Richard was rather stupefied as he looked at the invigorating potion in his hands. This potion was designed to restore both energy and mana at the same time, something much more valuable than a regular revitalizing potion. Something big had to have happened for him to be given this, but instead of asking he drank it all in one gulp before following her to the main castle. Richard once again saw Gatton in the command room, and the magical map in the center already had its contents changed. The plane was unknown to Richard, but the area was steeped with magma. This plane was most likely to be a level of hell, or the deep abyss. Or perhaps it was another place with similar properties. Gatton's hands were pressed on the edges of the map as he stared fixedly at the projection. A powerful aura was continuously emanating from his body, so thick it was almost visible to the naked eye. On the end of the map was a pair of knights dressed in heavy armor. There were no exposed areas other than T-openings on their helmets, with even their palms covered in scale mail. Their armor was frighteningly heavy, and if one looked from the side they could see that it was over 15 centimeters thick. It was unknown just how much power one needed to pierce through such dense armor. The two knights looked the same, dressed in black stinger sets which were the most popular among heavy knights. However, the Archaron emblem was embedded on different sides for them, one on the left and the other on the right, to differentiate between the two. This was Kaelin and Cade, a pair of brother-sister twins that belonged to Gatton's 13. Although their equipment was ordinary and seemed not to have any additional effects, their auras were no lower than Senma's. Mordred stood quietly behind Gatton, and when he saw Richard enter, his lips cracked open into a silent smile as a form of welcome. Gatton stood up straight, and looked at Richard with his hawk-like eyes. "Richard, you're here. Let me see how much magic you have recovered." Yup, a good deal of it. You'll be ready by the time the ceremony starts. Senma. Take another invigoration potion for use on the journey later. Senma responded with a noise from her throat, as Richard looked in bewilderment. What ceremony? An offering to the eternal dragon. Kiddo, your luck isn't too bad. We have enough tributes now. But then, your luck can be said to be very bad as well, because there isn't much time for you to prepare. Take this. Soon, Gatton tossed a black box over to Richard. The moment Richard caught the box, both of his hands sunk down, causing him to nearly fall to the ground. This box was close to 100 kilograms heavy, and he had to activate eruption to regain his balance and catch it firmly. Open it and look inside. Richard opened the box, and a burning stench wafted out from within. Shockingly, this stench had an overwhelming surge of power. There was a mass of flesh in the box, blazed so much it had turned black. The power of laws circled it, releasing a powerful aura to the pulse of its beating. Demon heart. Richard said, aghast. From a lesser demon lord. And this too, catch. Gatton tossed a larger box over this time. This box was extremely heavy too, but the moment it reached Richard it stopped on its own, before floating down and resting gently on the ground, as if there were a pair of invisible hands that had carried it. The moment Richard could see the box's opening, the lid lifted. There was an equally stinging stench here, but it wasn't accompanied by any heat. This aura was thick with darkness and rot, the head of a devil with more than 10 amber eyes open. The numerous horns on the head were still sharp and well preserved. Even the arc of the horns were not changed, and everything seemed to come to a still, as if its appearance had been like this for a long time. This head was chopped off a long time ago, and no longer showed any signs of life. However, the powers of corrosion and darkness were still well preserved under the powers of magic. The head of a devil. Richard gasped. It's a greater devil. However, it has been dead for some time now, and it's not that easy to sever the head of another devil. This is for you, the private property of your old man. You struck it big this time. Gatton said as he put on the helmet he carried in his hands, as if he was going into a battle shortly. Richard looked blankly at the two boxes, as his gaze swept past the people present. Kaelin and Cade were masked, so he naturally couldn't see their expressions, but both Mordred and Senma were just as shocked as him. Richard's abilities had recorded the data of these demon and devil remnants that were only spoken of in the books he had read. To humans, going to the deep abyss or hell to kill either a demon or a devil was extremely difficult. As for those devils and demons that had managed to traverse plains and enter Norland, they had long since been slain and offered to the eternal dragon. To look at these prized items that were still filled with power was not something common. The demons were from the deep abyss, and the devils from hell. These were both prime planes just like Norland, but vastly larger. The environment there was extremely special, giving an abnormal boost to its residents' powers. Each level of these places was a semiplane unto itself, with a being unifying the area. As for the exact number of layers they had, nobody knew for sure. They were both an amalgamation of countless layers of planes. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 98. The Road at Night. It was said that the deepest trenches of the abyss and hell were linked, with countless demons and devils in the midst of an endless battle killing each other ceaselessly. This information had been procured from other races that humans had met while traveling the countless planes. Even that was but the tip of the iceberg, gathered from traces in songs of myth and legend. The quintessential part of a demon was its heart, while the power of a devil came from its skull. Even a fragment of a devil's skull was extremely expensive in Norland, forget the complete one of a greater devil. Gatton spoke of it casually, but this devil's skull must have been one of the Archeron's greatest treasures. Only before that fresh lesser demon Lord Hart did the devil's skull lose some of its luster. At this moment, a handsome youth appeared in the common room, invisible to Richard until he showed his presence. It was the odd thief, Certain. Certain smiled enchantingly, yet his voice sounded solemn. Master, High Priestess Ferlin has already made preparations, and the ceremony can begin at any time. As for the other nobles, they have already discovered traces of our plans, and begun to amass experts along the road leading to the Church of the Eternal Dragon. I sense at least 17 powerful experts. Should I dispatch some of them first? Gatton was already in full armor by now. He tidied himself up, saying, "There's no need for that. I know we're outnumbered right now, but we can't wait for the rest to return. Let's set off now. Where's my sword?" Mordred placed an ancient sword in front of Gatton. It didn't look particularly remarkable, its copper scabbard already rusted. Apart from a few undecipherable runes on the blade, it looked just like any other. Gatton hung the sword at his waist before saying, "Let's go. We'll see if those old fogies of the 6th level dare to strike. Richard, take the 2 boxes along with you. Remember to cast a floating spell on each of them or you won't be able to move them." Moments later, a party of knights appeared at the teleportation temple, the road before them leading to the church. They trudged upwards on the winding path, the tall and magnificent trees littering the path gleaming with the brilliance of the rainbow of the moons as they cast large shadows on the ground. The church was only a few kilometers from the teleportation temple. From leaving the site of the temple's guards, there were only 2 bends and a kilometer's straight walk before they reached the church. However, that night the small distance seemed never-ending. The party was formed of 6 of the 13 knights, with Gatton leading at the front. The horse he rode was clad in black armor, its footsteps occasionally sending out a burst of flames. This was Dark Moon Amber, a trademark of Gatton's that was the nightmare of many nobles of the Alliance. Richard himself was guarded by the twins Kaelin and Cade, with Senma right behind him. Mordred brought up the rear, guarding their backs. Lava was different from Gatton's horse, its hooves stomping the floor restlessly, as if impatient at the unhurried pace of the party. Richard was sat on an armored horse, and the 2 boxes, one large and one small, were hung behind him without any concealment or disguise. His heart was beating irregularly, as he felt multiple icy spiritual forces scanning his body as well as the 2 boxes. Many pairs of hawk eyes were looking over at their party from deep in the forest, with quite a few bearing news to the outside world. Up above in the distance, the Church of the Eternal Dragon was shrouded in a glow of golden light, as if a palace of the gods. It stood tall in the sky, vanquishing the rainbow light of the moons to leave behind only a faint silhouette of an hourglass, with many layers of mysterious and obscure runes encircling it. This miraculous sight was a sign of the Church of the Eternal Dragon preparing to host the highest form of sacrificial ceremony. There were 3 grades of ceremonious sacrifice to the Eternal Dragon, with the highest requiring the participation of many priests and clerics. It would give the offerer tremendous amounts of blessings, and rumor had it that one could get a chance to talk directly to the Eternal Dragon itself. However, not even the imperial family had managed to do that. Or perhaps someone had done so once, keeping it a secret afterwards. The grade of the sacrificial ceremony was dependent on the sacrificer and the offerings. However, a higher grade of ceremony did not necessarily mean better rewards. If one tried a greater ceremony without the offerings to match, they would not receive the blessings of the god. This had already happened once before in Faust, so looking at this odd party and the phenomenon on top of the mountain, even an idiot would realize they had goods which could carry them through the highest grade of ceremony. The value of these goods could drive a third of the 14 nobles of Faust crazy, especially those who were ranked towards the back. Even including the imperial family and the top 5 noble houses, there wasn't a guarantee of such a ceremony being held every year in Faust despite the number of ceremonies performed in general. The Archerons had already demonstrated their prowess by taking over the 3rd island of the 7th layer, but barely over a year in that position the general evaluation of them was still low. This upstart family had yet to stand firm on its 2 feet, but already wanted to perform the highest grade of sacrificial ceremony. Even if there weren't any direct conflicts of interest, this had brought upon the Archerons the unrest and annoyance of the aristocrats. Furthermore, a sacrificial ceremony of the highest grade could very well affect the current balance of power in Faust. Hence, this 1 kilometer stretch felt never-ending, and the current situation was as tense as a pulled bowstring. It could be further tightened, or released immediately in the next moment. Richard's palms were soaked with cold sweat, the killing intent around him suffocating. It was only now that he could truly feel the pressure brought by power. It was a natural suppression due to a difference in strength, making him feel as powerless as the first humans to discover the endless plains. This had nothing to do with courage at all. Calm down, and stay even more calm, Richard reiterated these words in his heart, maintaining his posture while riding the horse. He did not dare cast any magic. In such a precarious balance, any unnecessary actions could tip the scales of the current situation. With a crashing noise, the sounding of snapping twigs suddenly sounded in the nearby trees. Immediately after, Richard felt a black-garbed figure slowly advancing towards his party. His body tensed immediately. Each time his senses alerted him of the approaching figure, the pressure that was threatening him grew. How could such a skilled expert tread across tree branches but not conceal himself in such a dark night? This was a probe, and a provocation. If not handled properly, their party would very well be facing an all-around attack. Gatton seemed not to have discovered anything, his expression relaxed. He had even begun humming a rhyme of a distant, unknown plane. The notes were light and merry, even mixed in with some high and low pitches. Ember trotted along happily as well, its hooves matching the upbeat rhythm of Gatton's humming. That somehow began to unravel the tension Richard was feeling. The dark figure gradually got closer, and it seemed to be stuck close to the ground. It was like a creeping leopard, able to launch a fatal attack at any moment. He had already left the camouflage of the forestry, and now had a large shadow projected on the ground. Under the eyes of everyone present, this figure pressed on closer. 6 meters, 5, 4. When Gatton was about to pass it by, they were just 1 meter apart. At such a distance, the black figure need not advance any longer. With just an outstretched hand it could attack Gatton at any moment, and a number of fatal points on Gatton's body were exposed. Darkmoon Ember's flank, its limbs, Gatton's thighs and ankle, even his waist was blatantly exposed. Richard, who was several meters behind, could clearly see that the black figure shuddered ever so slightly, and the body swelled with power, ready to launch a killing blow. However, Gatton passed him by, and his attacks were never unleashed. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 99. Ceremony. The next to meet the dark figure were the pair of twins, Kaelin and Cade, with Richard in between them. Kaelin was on his right, and the dark figure stood right in her way. However, she was the same as Gatton, seemingly unaware of the existence before her as she continued to ride at an unhurried pace. Her mount's metal hooves were raised in the next moment, preparing to stomp the ground. A flicker of flames unusually appeared at the bottom when the front two hooves were raised. It seemed like Kaelin had a strength rune attached to the hooves, and if this stomp hit its target they would suffer the equivalent of an all-out attack from her. The black figure did not dare act recklessly, but this knight under Gatton did not fear anything in her path. The figure hesitated for a moment, but chose to duck in a lightning-quick manner when the hooves stomped down before disappearing into the darkness. He had not dared to strike after all, and could only choose to retreat. After the dark figure left, Richard suddenly felt that the forestry on the sides of the road seemed much quieter. The party advanced for another 100 meters, before rapid thuds of hooves were heard. A squad of Imperial Knights approached them, and when their leader saw Gatton from afar, he immediately raised his voice, "Marquis Gatton. By decree of His Imperial Majesty, we are to escort you to the Church of the Eternal Dragon for the sacrificial ceremony." When the Imperial Knights appeared, Richard knew that he was now safe. However, he knew that he could not have avoided walking through the stretch of road earlier. If they hadn't relied on their own strength to make it this far, they would never have seen this squad of knights. Both parties exchanged greetings before getting off horseback. They chose to walk the remaining distance, in a show of their reverence for the Dragon of Eternity and Light. 2 rows of young and beautiful girls from the church were stood before the gates. The faint gold high-collared robes added an elegant and pure look to them, making them all the more captivating. These were members of the Church of the Eternal Dragon. As they gained more blessings from the dragon, they would become clerics, then shamans, then priestesses, before eventually becoming high priestesses in charge of their own church. It was no secret that the Eternal Dragon favored girls. The Imperial Knights stopped in front of the gate, while the Archaran party continued moving forward. In this party of armor-clad knights, Richard, who wore mage robes and carried 2 boxes of differing sizes, was extremely catching to the eye. The gates of the church were a towering 20 meters tall, and when they entered, Richard's vision suddenly blurred before he found himself in a desert. This was an endless desert plain, as if the concept of a horizon did not exist. The skies seemed to connect to the earth, yet some mysterious powers had grounded the sand into powder which littered the air. Several sand dunes close by had broken stone pillars, evidence of the passage of time. From the outside, the Church of the Eternal Dragon was just a square kilometer in size, but within it Richard couldn't tell the area of this desert even with precision. At the center of his vision were traces of the church, only that half of it had already crumbled. The tall granite walls and few remaining pillars could allow one to guess the magnificent glory of the church in its heyday. At the center of all this was a broken stone platform. It was where the sacrifice would be offered, and the ceremony would take place. Several threads of light were flowing in from the corners of the desert, forming a huge hourglass in front of the party. Once fully formed, the hourglass shattered, to reveal a woman that exuded a divine and dignified aura. She was wearing sacred white robes, with a triple crown resting on her head. In her hands was a faint golden scepter, while mysterious golden runes that evoked an archaic feeling filled the robes and crown. Gatton stepped forward, bowing as he paid his greetings. "Exalted High Priestess Ferlin, this is my son Richard. He will be the one performing the sacrifice this time." Ferlin smiled and nodded her head. This smile of hers was beautiful and gentle, yet it was also distant and faint, surpassing the existence of humans, overlooking on all life. The High Priestess looked at Richard and smiled. "Fortunate child, I hope that your sincerity will allow the Supreme Dragon of Eternity and Light to be satisfied with your offerings. The sacrificial ceremony has been prepared. I will wait for you at the altar. After you have made your preparations, you can come by my side and begin the ceremony." After finishing, the High Priestess walked on a faint golden road made of light towards the altar. Preparations? Although Richard had tried his best to understand the process of a sacrificial ceremony, he did not know what he needed apart from the offerings. Gatton chuckled and patted him on the shoulder with vigor. There's nothing much to prepare. Even if it's the same offerings, different people will receive different blessings. So kiddo, everything depends on your luck. All right. There is something I'd forgotten to tell you. Because the Arcarans have our own floating island, the Eternal Dragon will ask how you want to allocate the blessings between your family and yourself. Remember to keep it all. Alright then, go on kiddo. Good luck. And thus, albeit with some difficulty, Richard dragged the 2 boxes towards the altar in the middle of the desert. Although he'd used a floating spell on them, these organs weren't light at all. Finding his spot, Richard couldn't help but look around. Only standing right in front of the altar could one truly feel the archaic grandeur that had withstood the erosion of time. There seemed to be no beginning nor end, and no matter how extravagant something was, it would perish with time passing by, turning it into something for future generations to lament. But why did they not want to rebuild this place? As if reading Richard's doubts, Ferlin said gently, "Child, any true church of the Eternal Dragon is rubble like this, and can never be repaired. Even if we built a magnificent church here with the greatest of spell formations, when a ceremony begins it will all be reduced to rubble in the river of time. Not even gods can withstand the sands of time, so the scene you see before you is the same one that has existed throughout the eons. Thank you for your teachings." Richard's heart skipped a beat, as if comprehending something from her words. He bowed slightly, like he would towards the teachers in the deep blue, before asking, "What should I do now?" "Firstly, prepare your offerings," Ferlin ordered. After watching Richard open the 2 boxes, even she with her indifference was still slightly moved. The head of a greater devil? What a rare offering. It's actually the heart of a lesser demon lord. What a lucky child. Let us begin the ceremony, then. The heart cannot be out here much longer. Ferlin clasped her hands before her chest, as she lowered her head towards the altar. She began to chant a mysterious and obscure incantation with varying notes. As she spoke each syllable, the endless skies began to be filled with traces of golden scriptures, like a rain of gold. A mysterious and ancient aura emerged from the void and began spreading through the area. Very soon the skies turned dark, and finally they were devoid of all color. Transcending the voidless sands of time, a new universe gradually appeared, with light and life of its own. Countless brilliant stars began to travel their paths, sucking Richard's soul in. He'd been trying to decipher the meaning behind all the runes, but now he felt his bloodline racing quickly. This was not the fervor and rage he felt during the awakening of his bloodline, but a thirst for the source of life and belonging. As the incantation reached its climax, Ferlin's voice had grown extremely shrill, as if she was a dragon singing in the sky. She touched the altar with the scepter in her hands, causing the broken stone platform to radiate golden light, forming a pillar of light that penetrated the skies. The pillar began to expand, beginning to cover the entirety of the ruins, with undecipherable scriptures glowing and fading seamlessly on its surface. As for the skies, they were filled with the cries of a dragon, as well as the whistling of the desert wind. An incomparably mighty aura descended, and High Priestess Ferlin retreated from the borders of the light pillar. Richard was left alone on the altar, and from that moment on the people outside would not be able to look within. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Volume 2. Book 1, Chapter 100. Ceremony. Ferlin's scepter stopped moving, and she disappeared from her position to reappear beside Gatton. She smiled, "Marquis Gatton, I'd never thought you would have brought such great offerings this time. The blessings I receive will increase significantly as well. However, while this child will undoubtedly become a rune master in the future, that level of offerings, it seems to be a waste. I hear the enemies of the Arcarans are still aplenty, and equally strong." Gatton inhaled deeply before saying, "This is what he deserves, and very soon he will be sent to a different plane. If he can get more blessings, then so it shall be. As for our enemies, they can come if they want to, I'll teach them regret. The High Priestess Ferlin nodded her head and spoke elegantly, then we shall see the results of this child's blessings, and pray that the gifts will be related to the sands of time. An inconceivably massive conscience had already enveloped Richard in that pillar of light, pulling his consciousness back from the void. Back to his senses, the boy was shocked to find that he was now a regular human, just like any other. His mana was sealed, and so was his bloodline. Realizing the ceremony had already begun, he immediately lifted the devil skull from the larger chest and painstakingly placed it on the altar. Brilliant light was formed as soon as the skull made contact with the altar, turning into another pillar that charged up into the skies. The skull gradually turned transparent in the light, before innumerable runic scriptures appeared from within. They then converged, disappearing into the void. It seemed as if the altar was set ablaze, as the countless scriptures turned into golden butterflies that fluttered towards the distant stars. As for the skull itself, it had disintegrated into nothingness. A ray of light appeared from the void, shining directly onto Richard. It soon turned into a cocoon of light, manifesting those countless runes within. Richard heaved a sigh of relief. The appearance of the light cocoon indicated that the eternal dragon was satisfied with the offering. At the very least, he would not receive any divine punishment. However, there were no need for worries right from the start. Under usual circumstances, a greater devil's skull was enough to conduct the highest grade of sacrificial ceremony. Although it was extremely difficult to grasp the different forms of the light cocoon, Richard still tried to observe it. All of his knowledge before this came from books or libraries, and to witness something like this up front gave him a greater understanding that would benefit him greatly as he tried to learn the laws of the worlds in the future. Every scene, every rune, represented a certain type of divine blessing. For example, a rune shaped like armor would indicate a chance to get more powerful equipment. Crystals and gems would yield rare resources. What these runes manifested into now would be determined by the degree of the blessing received. Of course, the most precious of all was the emblem of the Church of the Eternal Dragon, the hourglass. Any blessing which touched upon the sands of time would be incomparably powerful. The time the blessing took to manifest determined its power, and from what the numbers in Richard's vision told him, the blessings were random with no set rules. The light cocoon abruptly split open and formed an hourglass, and a large one at that. Richard's breathing halted for a moment, before he was overtaken by glee. Golden beads of sand flowed within the hourglass, the sands of time itself. The gargantuan will enveloped him once again. The first stage of the ceremony had ended. Richard suppressed his glee, before using copious amounts of effort to place the demon's heart on the altar. Without any of his powers, it was no easy feat to lift this thing that weighed over 100 kilograms. If not for him being force-fed his way into a strong, healthy body, he wouldn't even have been able to move this heart. Very soon, Richard looked at the altar with anticipation. The offerings made to the Dragon of Eternity and Light all possessed mighty power. They could be fragments of divine weapons, or even whole gems. Items that came from foreign planes would receive even more blessings than those from Norland. The more powerful the offering, the more the blessings. Thus, just based on the ranks of power, the demon lord's heart was much more precious than the devil's skull. The altar trembled as the heart was placed upon it, before coming to a stop. Once more, Richard unknowingly held his breath. A low sigh suddenly rang out, in the raspy voice of a dragon. Blinding golden light seeped out from every corner of the altar, forming several dozen torrents of gold before piercing the demon heart. The heart writhed violently, and an ear-piercing wail actually came from within. Very soon, it floated in midair together with the torrents of golden light. More light appeared above the altar from the void, once again boring into the heart from all directions. The heart gradually turned transparent, and the light gold of runic scriptures appeared and rose into the skies once again. However, this scripture still had strands of golden light connecting to the heart, causing it to beat 10 times faster than it was. Each pulse pulled some of the runes back, but with the passage of time more left than returned. Eventually the runes began to break apart, forming golden butterflies that soared into the void. The process of digesting the demon's heart was evidently much slower than that for the devil's head. A little under half remained even after 10 minutes, and by then the light of blessing appeared once again in the void. This time, the light cocoon did not transform much before adopting the form of an hourglass. However, the glow did not cease. This cocoon was much brighter and more powerful than the one before, causing Richard to divert his gaze after a while as he was left unable to look on. As the pillar of light continued to shine, the ball of light turned even brighter. The demon heart finally disintegrated, leaving 2 hourglasses floating atop the altar. The piercing brilliance of the powerful light subsided, revealing a ball of pure gold light. Richard was shocked. That ball of light was not very rare in such a ceremony. It was an egg, one that could be opened to reveal powerful divine weapons or rare resources, which while valuable wasn't of much use. At this moment, a bizarre, almighty, and emotionless voice rang in Richard's ears. "Mortal, how do you want to allocate the blessings amongst your family and yourself?" Richard immediately recalled Gatton's words, but the happenings that occurred on his way here surfaced once again in heart. Gatton and his rune knights had relied on their extraordinary might to repel their enemies in the darkness. Perhaps their enemies could have annihilated them, but the price to pay would be excruciatingly high. At the very least, the enemies at the forefront would accompany them in the afterlife. The Sacred Alliance was but a pile of scattered sand. They could not work together, fingers forming a palm to crush the enemies before them. Although the parties spying on the Arcarans could not wait for their death, they did not want to sacrifice themselves to elevate the status of others. Back then, if the Knights of the Arcarans had not displayed such an impressive show of might, the wolves in the darkness would have lunged forward and devoured them. Richard had read traces of the Silver Moon Elves' history from the books in the family library and had some glimpses of the truth. He acknowledged that Gatton had his own considerations for the conquest of Evernight Forest. Regardless of what the actual truth of that expedition was, he had a sudden impulse. It was now time to return some favors to the Arcarans. The almighty voice rang out again in his consciousness, "Mortal, how do you want to allocate the blessings amongst your family and yourself?" Richard's expression grew resolute, "Split them evenly." As soon as he made his reply, the 2 hourglasses shrank immediately to half their size, with no further changes to the ball of light. The voice rang out again, "Mortal, you may now receive your blessings. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 101. Ceremony. Richard stood up and stretched his hands out to reach the 3 divine marks floating in the air. When his fingers came into contact with them, the mysterious power of the eternal dragon would take form as an appropriate blessing. He first touched the hourglass formed by the devil's skull. It cracked open, and the fine golden sand entered his body to form a complicated golden scripture that disappeared into him. Richard felt a new mysterious force in his body, which filled his muscles with vigor. The meaning of the scriptures surfaced in his consciousness: divine blessing, torrent of life. In the next 15 years, his body would not age. This blessing was akin to prolonging one's life by 15 years. Humans in Norland only naturally experienced this at 2 stages in their lives, when they entered the Saint Realm, and once they entered the Legendary Realm. Apart from these, the only other way to prolong one's life was through the blessings of the Eternal Dragon. To prolong one's life was the desire of all intelligent creatures, so the blessings of the Sands of Time were the most valuable of all. It was needless to emphasize the importance of life. Even during struggles for power, in eras of dazzling stars and brilliant heroes, many a time the easiest victory was outliving your opponents. Richard had never expected to receive such a blessing in his first ceremony. He suppressed his elation, and reached for the second divine mark. The second hourglass broke as well, the beads of golden sand becoming a ray of light that entered his body in the form of a scripture. Once again, he was given knowledge of the blessing, divine blessing, unhurriedness. When he entered a lesser plane in the future that did not possess a Church of the Eternal Dragon, the time flow there would jump to 10 times Norland's time. This effect would last for 30 years, but would not affect Norland or a higher plane. Thinking about it, this was truly a divine gift. With it, he could enter another plane in war for 10 years, but only a single year would pass in Norland. Although the flow of time varied in the myriad of planes, the differences were normally quite small. Unhurriedness actually gave him tenfold the time. Of course, one would still spend their life force in that lesser plane. Staying there for 30 years would age their body correspondingly. Only in tandem with Torrent of Life could one proceed ceaselessly with planar wars. Although the first two blessings did not provide him with any battle prowess, life and time were the greatest blessings for humans. Richard could barely control his excitement and glee as he once again reaching for that ball of light. He was extremely curious as to this mysterious blessing, but he did not harbor much hope. Mathematics told him that his good luck so far would not affect the third try. However, even if this ball of light did not reveal any precious blessings, Richard would not be disappointed. Because his luck had already been good enough until now. However, the ball of light had completely absorbed most of the demon's heart, so to claim that there were no expectations at all was impossible. However, before Richard's left hand could touch the ball of light, a ray of light suddenly flitted past the string of beast ivory on his hand. The largest piece in the center suddenly flashed, absorbing that ray of light. It seemed to be set ablaze immediately, radiating golden flames of time that burned Richard's hand in the process. Arg! Richard screamed, stumbling backwards as he waved his left hand continuously. Fortunately, while the time flames were violent, they were extinguished in the very next moment. He took the ivory bracelet off his hand, discovering a deep scar in the shape of that ivory upon it. The pain the time flames inflicted upon him was different from that of regular fire. Although it hurt terribly in that moment and he'd been scarred by it, the pain disappeared almost immediately. Richard moved his left hand, but could not feel anything amiss. He looked at the bracelet again, and it seemed to be as good as new with no traces of being damaged. Richard heaved a sigh of relief, not knowing why he had favored this bracelet so heavily. It might have been because of Mountainsea's barbaric farewell hug, or the words that she had said. He put on the bracelet once again, wanting to continue on with the ceremony, but was interrupted. The almighty aura descended upon the altar once more, this time even more dominating than before. When the ancient and distant aura flashed past Richard, he felt the birth and destruction of the endless planes through the eons of time. This overpowered existence filled Richard's soul immediately, and his body no longer heeded his own will as he slowly knelt before the altar. Mortal, once again, the mighty voice rang in Richard's consciousness. However, this time it wasn't a robotic cold voice, but an ancient one that commanded utmost reverence. Richard suddenly trembled and understood that this was no longer a thread of divine power which would elicit automatic responses, but the direct conscience of the Dragon of Eternity and Light itself. He was momentarily stunned. It was simply indescribable to have a direct audience with the Dragon of Eternity and Light, that was sovereign even of the higher planes. At this moment, outside of the light pillar, Gatton stared at a golden hourglass in his hands, his face filled with disbelief. This small hourglass was made of translucent crystal, the fine golden sand within it trickling down continuously regardless of the angle it was held at. There was a total of 10 such hourglasses, and when put together they weren't larger than Gatton's palms. The important thing was that they weren't simple decorative ornaments, but formed from the divine energy of the eternal dragon. Anyone who broke them would obtain blessings. Just 1 minute ago, 10 streaks of light were shot out from within the pillar, forming these miniature hourglasses that fell freely to the ground. This incident happened too suddenly, and even with Gatton's physical prowess he was caught unprepared, almost allowing 2 of the hourglasses to fall to the ground. Fortunately, High Priestess Ferlin had waved her hands and 2 rays of light caught them before sending them to his hands. Gatton stared at the hourglasses in his hand, stupefied. Ferlin looked at the hourglasses and understood the situation. She said, "This is the blessings that the eternal dragon has given to the Arcarans, with each hourglass blessed with torrent of life. Whichever Arcaran opens these hourglasses will be given 3 to 5 years of life force." Ferlin smiled. "You have a good son, Marquis Gatton." She had heard Gatton's instructions to Richard before the ceremony. There was nothing secret to her within the church's bounds. It was simply unfathomable to be willing to allocate such a massive blessing to his family. Ferlin had presided over many ceremonies, and it was extremely rare for a family to allocate them to one individual. On the other hand, it was unheard of for an individual to allocate the blessings to their family. Gatton raised his head and looked at the light pillar. He could not see anything within, and only smiled wryly, not saying anything. Ferlin noted the expression that Gatton put on, seemingly in thought. Her eyelashes suddenly fluttered, which gave this revered high priestess a tinge of humanity. She then reminded Gatton, "Marquis, the blessings that were granted to the Arcaran family far exceeded these 10 hourglasses. You had better look at the situation of your floating island." Gatton received another shock, as he raised his hand in a gesture. Senma left the church grounds immediately, and returned within a minute. Although her voice was suppressed, the slight trembling was still evident. "Master, our floating island is absorbing the elemental energy of the void. The perimeter has grown by 50 meters, and it's still expanding. Furthermore, the trajectory of the islands is shifting. As per my judgment, we'll soon swap places with the second island." After hearing this shocking news, Gatton did not seem happy. Instead, he squinted and muttered, "This smelly brat, If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 102. Seed of Destiny. There were 2 ways for the families in Faust to improve their position. The first was direct conflict, while the other was what was currently happening to the Arcarans, to have luck so supreme that they would receive blessings from the gods. The expansion of the island here was secondary. What was more important was that it proved the family had the grace of the eternal dragon for a while, at least for the next year and at most for the next 3. To launch a frontal assault on such a family in Faust would likely result in dire consequences, such as a drop in blessings received by the attacking family themselves. However, there were very few families who have actually done this throughout the history of Faust, one of the contributing factors being the randomness and unpredictability of such grace from the gods. Besides, without the strength to make such rankings foundational, it would all be false glory. Barely achieving such a ranking would not ensure that the family could maintain it for a long time to come. Unless the family has already made sufficient preparations to climb through the hierarchy, it would be futile to try their luck. For example, the islands on the 7th layer did not have any magic defense, while there was divine magic protecting the islands in the 6th. This was not the first time Gatton had offered a sacrifice. For the island to change orbits required luck, yes, but it had to come from the blessings of the sacrifice. Unfortunately, it seemed like Richard had left half of the blessings given to him to the Arcarans. Suddenly, before he could utter a word, Gatton turned pale. High Priestess Ferlin also revealed shock from the side, the hands holding onto her scepter beginning to tremble uncontrollably. Gatton was dumbstruck. He immediately looked towards High Priestess Ferlin, expecting her to have been her usual calm and elegant self. Yet, what greeted him was an unrestrained look of astonishment, ecstasy, and bubbling reverence. Mordred, though late by a moment, had the same change of expression. He looked up into the endless sky above the church, where an indescribably enormous conchant was slowly descending. Outside of that, everything was peaceful and serene. Be it the rest of Gatton's knights or the other members of the clergy further out, none of them were aware of the events at all. The only thing they realized was the peculiar behavior of their master, which earned various stares. High Priestess Ferlin tried her best to maintain a calm expression, though her voice did not stop trembling. In a low, almost mumble, she said, "This is the main conchant of the eternal dragon, a true miracle. This is impossible, it was merely the heart of a lesser demon lord. How did it draw the descent of the conscience of the mighty eternal dragon? Suddenly, she turned to stare at Gatton, eyes shining like stars. Marquis, what other offerings did you prepare? Though shocked upon hearing that this was the main conscience of the eternal dragon, Gatton was able to relax, loosening his taut nerves. Smiling bitterly, he shrugged, those two are all I offered. This is the church of the eternal dragon, how can I keep any secrets from you? The dazzling shine from the eyes of High Priestess Ferlin started to dim. Without saying anything more, she gazed at the pillar of light with incredible zeal, conviction, and sincerity. It was a pity that even she could not see through the screen formed from the strength of the eternal dragon. Even her superior status did not grant her the right to disrupt a ceremony that did not belong to her. All of a sudden, High Priestess Ferlin leaned her head towards Gatton. In a deliberately hushed voice, she whispered, Marquis sir, I recall you saying that Richard will be going on an expedition to the numerous planes very soon? That's right, I have already prepared a suitable secondary plane marking for him, I've already established a foothold there, Gatton replied. I have an apprentice, a level 8 cleric named Flozan. I hope you can give her a spot on Richard's core team. With a stern expression, Gatton asked, the same one who received the title of Daybreak? Ferlin nodded, that's her. Titles were not self-conferred in the church, instead granted by the eternal dragon after one received enough blessings. Only 2 officials of the church in Faust had been conferred such a title, Ferlin the First Light of Dawn and Flozan Daybreak. Muttering to himself, Gatton nodded repeatedly while signaling agreement. Sure. High Priestess Ferlin laughed, the divine beauty immediately lighting up everything before everyone's eyes. Reaching out her arm, she placed it on Gatton's chest, promising, Marquis, if you fulfill this promise, you shall have the highest level of friendship from me for 10 years, but... Gatton grinned along. The effects of Ferlin's friendship on the Archerons, even if only personal, was a valuable asset in Faust that would have clear effects. The time limit was just something any priest of the eternal dragon would impose on anything, it was their way of expressing their faith. Ferlin added, Richard hasn't chosen his followers yet, has he? What about his soul guard? Any candidates? There were a few suitable candidates from our death camp recently. He will choose for himself when the time comes. But yes, there aren't enough followers in his core team, Gatton explained. High Priestess Ferlin smiled meaningfully. I heard that the batch arriving at Makov Port next week is pretty good. Morfan, the portmaster there, still owes me some favors, that. I understand, Gatton responded with a nod. At that moment, Richard, who was within the screen, was indescribably shocked, unable to recover the autonomy of his body. The will and soul he'd thought of as firm were actually tottering with the ripples of time, threatening to collapse and dissipate at any moment. This was no intentional attack, just an aftereffect of the descent of the eternal dragon. However, the dragon's will was far too powerful. Even if it had slowed its descent, it still gave rise to tsunami-like waves of time. Mortal, the voice of the eternal dragon rang once again in Richard's soul. This time, the formidable existence only let a strand of consciousness into the range of the altar, and the strength of the soul's echo was halved. The first time it called out, Richard's soul was nearly destroyed. What can I do for you, mighty eternal dragon? Richard responded through clenched teeth, barely clinging on to his unstable consciousness. Mortal, I see offerings from you that please me. Put them on the altar, and you shall have a title and blessings. Offerings? Richard was stumped for words, he'd given all the offerings already. Unless he suddenly got an idea. He glanced at the ivory on the bracelet around his left wrist, it was radiating pale gold light, the power of time. This gift from Mountainsea was what had attracted the central will of the eternal dragon. Richard's thoughts immediately went over to the barbarian girl. Someone with hugs as heavy as mountains, with the greatest of backgrounds and most incredible wealth, but who'd never taken it all to heart. He did not hesitate for long. Almighty eternal dragon, forgive me for my impudence. This bracelet is a gift from my friend, I'm afraid I cannot offer it to you. It was difficult to say this, but Richard was firm. Mortal, all that you treasure now will eventually turn into nothingness. But it is what I treasure now, having it now is sufficient for me. The conscience of the eternal dragon appeared to have been shaken, though it rang again in Richard's consciousness afterwards. Mortal, if you ever change your mind after today, you may offer sacrifice to me in any of my churches. Soon after, the indescribable conscience gently faded, leaving Richard gasping desperately for air. He laid paralyzed on the ground, so weak he barely had strength to move his finger. As the gigantic conscience slowly rose above, he could almost feel his soul being lifted and drawn out of his body. However, he did see that as the main conscience of the eternal dragon left, there seemed to be a few specks of light dropping from overhead, blending into the time sphere that was still floating in the sky above the altar. Suddenly, a ripple of violently strong life force burst out of the time sphere. After catching his breath, Richard managed to stand and walk towards the time sphere, albeit with much difficulty. This was the biggest prize, though he had no idea what was inside. However, no matter what it used to hold, Richard completely did not have any expectations after rejecting the request of the eternal dragon. He reached out to touch the time sphere, causing a burst of strong light. A dark green egg appeared on his palm soon after, radiating a strong life force that could be felt even on the outside. Upon receiving the strange egg, Richard only got a short message in his mind. In fact, it was so short there was only a word, seed. Seed? What seed? While Richard was left confused, the brilliance of the altar had already faded. Once again it became an abandoned stone tower that was corroded by the sand and winds. The screen of time also slowly scattered into nothing. As Richard stood dazedly in front of the altar, carrying the seed in his hands, High Priestess Ferlin had already cried out in alarm, "How is it a seed? Seed? What is that?" A glimmer flickered in Gatton's eyes, though he had no idea what the seed was. He could tell from Ferlin's terrible complexion that it was definitely something unusual. With a complicated expression, High Priestess Ferlin started to explain slowly, "It is formally called the seed, but in private we refer to it as the seed of destiny and destruction. It is a blessing that is hard to describe. Its specific purpose is one of the most classified information of the church, that must never be leaked." It is both good and bad news that Richard was conferred the seed. On the good side, he will be able to give his enemies in the myriad planes a huge surprise. However, his journey out must be brought forward. We cannot let the seed take root in Norland, it has to enter another plane within a month. This request. You can take it to be a divine command from the eternal dragon himself. Grimacing, Gatton grabbed Richard's shoulder and pulled him by his side. Frowning, he asked, "Just 1 month?" "At most a month. The earlier he goes, the less damage there is to his sacred blessings." Ferlin was firm with her decision. "What about Flozan?" Gatton tried to sound Ferlin out from another direction. "Of course she will follow along. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc. Please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 103. Preparations. What is this seed? Richard could not obtain any more information no matter how hard he looked at the dark green egg. The only hint he'd received from the eternal dragon was that it was a seed, and none of his detection spells gave him any further information. Before he left the Church of the Eternal Dragon, High Priestess Ferlin stopped him to have a word. She mentioned her travels to other churches on the continent when she was young. During these practice years, she'd once read an extract from an epic written before recorded history. It praised a king who held a very hideous weapon. He treasured the supreme weapon at all costs, keeping it with him everywhere he went as he protected and improved its abilities at all costs. Richard thanked High Priestess Ferlin sincerely despite the vagueness of the information she'd given him. It was evidently a hint to the use of the seed, telling him of its importance and the amount of resources he'd have to give it in the future. The sharp boy also noticed little wrinkles appearing at the ends of her eyes after she spoke to him, making her look a few years older. She'd looked exceptionally bright right after the ceremony had ended. This was immediate evidence that Ferlin lost some grace. The priestess hosting the ceremony normally gained the grace of the eternal dragon, but just this bit of cryptic information had actually lost her far more than she'd earned even from a ceremony of this magnitude. Just that explained the importance of the seed. That was why Richard bowed to Ferlin sincerely before leaving the Church of the Eternal Dragon, saying earnestly, "Thank you for your guidance." Ferlin smiled and gently tapped Richard's shoulders with the scepter in her hands. "Richard, don't show any mercy. Destroying every enemy before you will be the best way to show your gratitude." Richard nodded seriously, standing up straight with a stern look on his young face. He'd experienced countless unforeseen events over the past few days, and the trials of life and death had instilled an aura in him that did not match his age. Gatton patted Richard's shoulder. "Let's go, kid. You don't have much time. You need to pack up tonight, making a move tomorrow morning. We'll talk about everything along the way." "Ah, right, take care of that seed in your hands. Don't let it get too far from you." They left the church the same way they'd arrived, with Gatton in the lead and Kaelin and Kate guarding Richard. Senma and Mordred were at the back. As they followed the route down from the church, they could see the still expanding Arkharan island switching positions with its neighbor. The second island of the seventh layer was filled with shouts, countless lights shooting up around it as those living on its edge teleported away from the crumbling buildings. The rocks on the outer rim just split off, falling down into the clouds. The foundations of the buildings collapsed, and they slowly tilted before falling down themselves. These islands were 3 kilometers up in the sky. Without a powerful ability or spell for flight, any living being would die immediately if they fell from such a height. All the plants, vegetation, and rocks immediately disappeared into the clouds. However, the buildings and living things that came later? They fell. At that moment, countless eyes were fixated on that stunning scene. From the other islands, from Faust, even from elsewhere in the continent, this incident had drawn attention. Gatton pointed at those 2 shifting floating islands, saying, "Do you see it? Kiddo, this is the result of the arrangement you made. It doesn't matter whether our floating island shifts forward or backwards, that is just false reputation. If I wanted to move up further, I would have continued my conquest. If you really want to return the favor of the Arkharans, then survive the planar wars. Only after you've accomplished yourself and reached my age should you talk about giving back to the family." Richard hugged the seed and nodded silently. He had a lot on his mind now, and was clueless on how to handle his relationship with Gatton and the other Arkharans. He thus decided to face the situation calmly and rationally. Once they got to their island, a butler moved to pack Richard's luggage. The children of the family had gotten wind of Richard's departure, so they came over to send him off. Demi, Venica, and Wennington were amongst them as expected, but all of them were there to demand their runes. However, their motives weren't exactly the same. Demi especially looked like she wouldn't let Richard off easy. She'd arrived just as Wennington was about to leave, forcing Richard to promise to complete her rune before she left in a huff. Once she left, the butler came to inform Richard that Gatton was waiting for him. The meeting point this time was Gatton's study. The room wasn't big, with shelves resting against the wall storing maps that were painted out on magic paper. There were a handful of history and philosophy books, with many more being about battle techniques and the art of war. There were about 10 odd books about cultural history, but all of it seemed to be about Silver Moon elves. On the wall behind Gatton was a map of the Norland continent, along with maps of 3 other planes. Thus, Richard didn't sense any cultured or scholarly aura when he first walked into the room. He instead smelt a thick scent of blood and fire. Gatton was sat on the table, cleaning a magical sword. He gestured to Richard to close the door behind him, muttering, "Kiddo, you have to start exploring other planes right away because of the seed. There's a saying in planar wars, even the beasts of Norland are prettier than the elves of other planes. Every living thing, even the gods of life in the plane, will be your enemy the moment you step foot in there. Every single person. Kill your enemies first, before you consider any other problems. Be merciless and apathetic, and know that in most cases the best choice is to extinguish all your enemies. You will only be digging your grave with kindness. I will not show any mercy, Richard replied. Gatton chuckled, don't be too confident yet, kiddo. There is a huge difference between wars in Norland and planar wars. Even I wasn't used to it. You're going to be visiting a lesser plane that restricts the power of its inhabitants to about level 15 by our standards. I've already set up a base there, so you'll have some guides when you enter. But don't be startled if anything unexpected happens. It would be odd if there wasn't any incident. You can never be prepared enough. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 104. Preparations. What kind of preparations should I make? Richard asked. I'll also need a batch of magic ingredients to craft elementary runes. That we have, but no more. Planar teleportation requires a large amount of magic crystals, and tunnels aren't stable to a new plane, so powerful magical objects might harm the connection. The plane you're going to explore this time will only be a low-grade one, so your party will be more important than the gear. Most of our magic crystals will be allocated towards the teleportation. Richard nodded his head in understanding. Gatton harumphed, and then solemnly said, Kiddo, you're already grown up. There's something I have to tell you. When you were younger, your mother performed an awakening ceremony with you, no? Richard's heart skipped several beats. Pure instinct told him that the secrets of this ceremony could not be revealed to anyone. Having obtained the blessings of wisdom and truth from the Codex of Elucia, he felt a need to keep mum about it. However, Gatton did not wait for his reply. I heard that there was a small hiccup during the ceremony, one that will change your life from those of regular humans. Nightmare creatures are likely to disturb your life in the following years, appearing randomly with unknown numbers and strength. Dealing with them will be fairly simple, just blast them to shreds with your spells. Just remember that fire and ice aren't very effective against them. There seemed to be a twinge of regret in Gatton's gaze. Remain vigilant, and constantly try to grow in power. Tomorrow will be the first stop of your journey, the death training camp of the Arcaran family. The commoners and slaves of the family are trained there, groomed into experts through the law of the jungle. Choose anyone you wish to be your soul guard, but pay heed to the choice you make. I only have one soul contract with me, and normally the only way to obtain one is a blessing from the Eternal Dragon. Don't think of getting a second copy anytime soon. Head to Makov Port afterwards, and find Portmaster Morfan and tell him you're there to pick some slaves. He'll arrange everything for you, and you can choose the best-suited warriors. Remember to pay attention to quality, not quantity. Gatton seemed to realize he was growing long-winded. Alright kiddo, do you have anything to tell me? Richard thought in earnest, but eventually shook his head. Let's talk about it again when I return alive. Just as Richard was about to leave, Gatton called out to him. Right, I'd forgotten something. The first rule of the Arcarans. Before you go to a different plane, you must choose a companion. At least one. And do it for your old man by today. As for packing your items, leave it to the housekeeper. Come, tell me, who do you want as your companion? Don't be shy, just say a name. Ah, that's right, as a spectator, I have a pretty good suggestion, want to hear it? Who? Demi? Richard asked. Amongst the teens that he had seen, Demi had the most potential. Of course it's not that lass. It's your cousin, Earl Alice. Gatton grinned. What? Richard almost cried out. In recent times, Alice had become a rising star amongst the Arcarans, second only to Gatton. Having become an earl only recently, Her rank in feudal lands were second only to Gatton and Marquis Sauron. Alice was different from Gatton, who relied on his 13 knights. She had overwhelming strategic might and great command over the battlefield. There was unspoken agreement in the family that she would exceed even Gatton if they had equal firepower. Richard had met Alice once, when he'd been caught up in that conspiracy with Falk. Beautiful with fiery red hair, her scars and the killing intent displayed with that giant sword had left a deep impression on him. Alice Arcaran was a stormy blaze of a woman coupled with a pair of ice-cold eyes. If he were to describe her on instinct, she was ice-wrapped by fire and lightning. Nobody would even think of becoming the partner of such a god of war. Richard smiled bitterly. Earl Alice wouldn't agree to it, would she? She will. Because she won't be able to find a better companion than you. If she doesn't agree, that's very easy too, just start an elders conference. Okay, I'll partner you two up now. Your old man has the final say in the council anyway. Gatton was brimming with confidence, but Richard felt like his father's smile held a trace of conspiracy. Hurry and choose someone for now, though. You can have more than one anyway. As for your elder cousin, we can put that aside, she has already returned to her land. I heard the place she just conquered is in turmoil. If only she'd waited 2 more days to return. Gatton said with disappointment. Richard could feel that being paired with the Earl would end in tragedy. Right now, he still had apprehensions and contradictions welling deep in his heart. He didn't feel close to the Arcarans yet, even if he could never sever his relationship with them. After pondering for a bit, a figure flashed in his mind, and he spoke immediately. I choose Coco, and I'll pick the next one when I return. Coco? Gatton was taken aback. This was a completely foreign word to him. Coco, Mary, Arcaran. Richard spat each word out. His cool demeanor let Gatton know that no further discussions were needed on this matter. Gatton did not dwell on the matter any further. Instead, he looked at Richard deep in the eye and said, Kiddo, remember this. After you have arrived at the new plane, every decision of yours will affect your follower's life and death. There is no place for impulse when you make a decision. Housekeeper. The door opened slightly, and the old housekeeper walked in. Gatton pointed at Richard and instructed, bring this kid to, Coco. She will be his companion henceforth. The housekeeper was startled, but he quickly returned to his normal calm before taking Richard with him. Bang! After Richard had left, Gatton smashed his fist on the table. He still couldn't recall who Coco was. That could only mean one thing, that girl had no special ability whatsoever. She was no different from an ordinary member of the family. After some time, Gatton's green face resumed a normal complexion. He sighed and shook his head. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 105. Partner. The housekeeper brought Richard to a part of the island he'd never been to, leading him through a murky corridor until they came upon a set of stairs. This was a 6-story building, situated behind the castle. There was no special layout to the construction and the rooms were extremely cramped, with many people being forced to fit into limited space. There were a total of 5 such buildings, built for the branches of the Arcaran family and the best of slaves, as well as high-ranked officials and young knights. Because of the relatively small area of the floating island, 2 to 4 people would share a single room. Coco, however, was on the top floor that was allocated to the youths of the family. Those were single rooms, because their partners hadn't been decided yet and they needed the convenience to enter and leave. The housekeeper seemed to be extremely familiar with everyone in the floating island. Although there were slaves which bowed towards him along the way, he did not stop and ask for directions. Instead, he brought Richard to a room at the end of the corridor and knocked on the door. Who is it? Coco's gentle voice appeared from behind the door. The housekeeper reported his name, and Coco seemed startled. Please wait for a moment. Moments later, Coco opened the door. She had a shawl draped over her shoulders, covering the upper half of her body, and a white gown which extended to the legs. Her dainty white feet which stepped on the carpet seemed rather striking. The time now was extremely late in the night, and it seemed like Coco had been woken up from her sleep. To the youths of the Archaran branch families, a housekeeper was a secondary figure of authority behind only Gatton himself. This was more so for the weaker families. Thus, the moment she heard the housekeeper was standing outside, Coco immediately got up and wrapped a shawl around herself without a change of clothes. She looked at the housekeeper, and then at Richard, who was standing behind, as if understanding everything. She immediately bowed. Are we going to conduct a magic experiment now? Please wait a few minutes, I'll have a quick change of clothes. To Coco, this job was far more important than her sleep. The housekeeper stopped her, speaking in an unhurried tone. No, this has nothing to do with magic experiments. Coco Mary Archaran, you have the honor of being chosen by young Master Richard as his first partner. Since young Master has to set off at first light tomorrow, he shall be spending the night with you. What? Coco cried in surprise, and her face turned pale as she unconsciously retreated by 2 steps. The housekeeper was not going to repeat things a second time for her. Instead, he went to the side and said to Richard, Young Master, please enter. Also, I will be waking you up at 5 in the morning for breakfast. We will be setting off at 6:30. The journey tomorrow is long, so please restrain yourself slightly tonight. Richard nodded with an indifferent expression. The housekeeper turned around to leave, but Coco dashed out from her room, pulling on his hand and asking fervently, Sir, how could it be me? You must have made a mistake. Yes, it can only be an error. The housekeeper did not try to pull away his hand nor explain, and seemed not to be bothered by Coco's words and actions. He only bowed elegantly to Coco, but the lack of explanation ascertained that none of this was wrong. In fact, this old housekeeper that was over 60 had never committed any mistakes in the past 20 years. Richard, who was still standing by the door, said indifferently, It's not wrong, I chose you. Coco's little mouth gaped open, and she was shocked for a moment. Afterwards, she hurried to Richard's side and bowed deeply. Young Master Richard, please consider again. I have no bloodline ability, and am only a level 2 illusionist without any other talents. A commoner like me cannot be matched with your peerless talent. I definitely will not be able to give birth to a prodigious child. Richard's brows furrowed. He could astutely feel that Coco's reactions and words were too unbefitting of the situation. No matter what reason she might have, anger began to swell deep in his head. Any youth brimming with vigor, if rejected in such a blunt manner, would definitely be angry. Coco's voice was rather loud, and several doors on the corridor had opened. Heads popped out from these doors, belonging to the young men and women. When they saw what was happening, they had spat their tongues out in jest or smiled politely towards the housekeeper before returning back into their rooms. The faces of several young women were filled with envy and jealousy. They could not piece together why Coco, whose only positive was her looks, would be chosen by Richard. Was she lucky or charismatic, and if so, why didn't they notice it before? Richard heard the curses of the young ladies, but acted as if he didn't. He looked at Coco's ashen face, as well as her eyes that began to well up with tears. He raised his head and asked the housekeeper, Can I still change partners? The eyes of the housekeeper did not betray his thoughts, and in an unchanging tone of voice, with neither lack nor excess of respect, he replied, This is your choice, and it has been approved by Master. Now that it has officially taken effect, it is even harder to revoke it. If you have a better candidate in your heart, my own suggestion is for you to choose again. After all, you have multiple choices granted to you. This complex authority granted to you, to my understanding, is limited to just one. However, if you insist on changing and choosing another companion, it can be done. But it requires Master Gatton's approval as well as some procedures. Next, You have to prove whether you used cocoa before or not, but. After the long explanation from the housekeeper, some hope seemed to appear on Coco's face. It seems like she had wanted to speak, but she was not so stupid as to interrupt the housekeeper, nor to try persuading Richard again. Suddenly, hastened footsteps sounded on the stairs, and a handsome young man appeared by the stairs. Richard seemed to notice it and turned around, his icy gaze landing on the young man. The housekeeper turned around as well, standing quietly and observing him. In an instant, the temperature of the 6th floor seemed to drop to sub-zero levels, causing some people to shiver. The young man suddenly turned rigid. His gaze flitted from Richard to the housekeeper, and then to Coco before he looked her deep in the eyes. Under the penetrative yet silent gaze of the housekeeper, sweat began to form on his forehead, causing him to be unable to speak. He greeted the housekeeper with a stiff bow, and said, "I came to the wrong floor." He turned around, his heavy footsteps seemed to reflect the feelings in his heart. Just then, Richard's somewhat ruthless voice sounded out, "I'm not changing anymore, it'll be her. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 106. Partner. Richard's voice wasn't loud, but it traveled quite far in the quiet corridor. Several disappointed gasps slipped through the throats of the young ladies peering out their rooms, and a huge thud resounded from the staircase as if something heavy had fallen to the ground. Coco's face remained pale, her little mouth opening and closing but with no words coming out. She stood rooted to the ground for a while, but neither Richard nor the housekeeper hurried her, as if they hadn't noticed her abnormal behavior. She finally lowered her head and returned to her room, waiting for Richard to enter. Before the door closed, the housekeeper reminded Richard to rest and not exert himself too much. Coco's room was quite small, a mere 10 square meters in size. The small bed, closet, and table were all it took to make it look packed. However, the room was quite neat, with a diary lying on the desk. Beside the diary were a quill pen and a bottle of ink. A vase of orchids sat on the windowsill, occasionally emitting a bout of fragrance. There were no extra decorations in the tranquil room, making it seem like that of the daughter of a gentleman from a village. This room was like a patch of plain white flowers amidst the floating islands and the volcano, possibly destroyed at any time. The room was obviously themed after Coco's temperament. The said girl was stood by the door, her hands clutching the hems of her skirt. Her head was kept low, hiding her expression, but just that showed her absolute nervousness. Richard looked over the room once more before walking in front of Coco. He reached for her light brown hair, stroking her face before he lifted her bowed head to make her look him in the eye. The girl trembled violently the moment his hand made contact with her skin. She tried to lower her head again, but Richard's hand firmly kept it in place, letting her know that this was a request that could not be refused. Coco lifted her head, her eyes filled with despair and fear. Tears had already welled up, but they did not flow. She suddenly sneezed, wrapping her arms around herself and trembling as if an extreme cold had descended upon the room. She had indeed felt chilly. Richard's hands were extremely cold, and his gaze all the more so. "So, apart from those like you, there's high-ranked slaves, guards, and," Richard paused, speaking the following words with intent, "novice knights here." Coco shivered once more. Richard did not let the conversation carry on further, instead taking his hand off her chin and allowing her head to bow down once again. He then proceeded to pry the hands wrapped in front of her chest apart, albeit in an unhurried manner. The shawl fell to the ground, revealing the young lady's rapidly heaving bosom. Coco's skin was snow white, and a trace of cleavage could be seen through the nightgown. Her breasts weren't proud mountains like Demi's, but for her body size they were perfect. Richard's right hand touched Coco's neck, causing her to tremble again. However, he paid no heed to her silent refusal, bringing his hand down along her skin all the way to her breasts. His finger hit the collar of her nightgown, but it did not stop. He instead pulled the gown down, revealing the surface of her breasts. Just as a tinge of pink revealed itself, he stopped, but his hand remained in that precarious position. Coco's heart was beating rapidly, but she mustered all her might to control her breathing. Any big movements and her breasts would spill out of the gown. At this moment, a devilish voice rang in her ears: "Our Karen women must maintain their chastity before a partner is selected for them. Have you abided by the laws?" Coco's body froze like a statue, and after some time she nodded her head with great difficulty. Richard smiled, tracing his fingers along the exposed flesh before speaking. "Really? But I don't trust you. How about you prove it to me right now?" After several minutes in this position, Coco relaxed her tensed body, and her hands dropped to her side as she abandoned all form of resistance. There was no use at all to resist in the first place. Her destiny had been set the moment she set foot on this island. If not Richard, someone else would have chosen her. This was a duty she had to perform in exchange for the privileges she received. If she did not want to do such a thing, she would have to leave. Coco knew that she was unable to leave. Once child of the family gained a certain amount of sensibility, they would realize the duties they had to fulfill and the privileges they could enjoy. They had to accept their fates. Richard harumphed at the sight of Coco dropping her resistance, retreating before he cast a detection spell on her body. As expected, there was very little magical response. She was almost like a regular human, and no runes could be attached on her body. Richard removed his outer garments, tossing his shoes by the door and climbing onto Coco's little bed. "Come here." He patted at the space beside him. Coco bit her lips, accepting her fate as she laid beside Richard. The bed was extremely narrow, and Richard's body was already fully grown. With Coco on it now, it was extremely cramped. The moment she laid on bed, Richard embraced her and their bodies stuck close together, each even being able to feel the heartbeat of the other. Coco's heart throbbed frantically, but Richard's heart actually slowed down, each thump resolute and strong. Contrary to her expectations, Richard did not make any other moves towards her. He instead closed his eyes, and after some time a light snore rang out. He had actually fallen asleep. Coco couldn't believe her eyes, yet it had happened before her. She did not dare move at all. She was afraid of waking him up. She maintained her awkward position for a while longer, but could no longer withstand it. This had only been 10 minutes, but to her it seemed to be a century. Her body softly collapsed on Richard's body, and exhaustion assailed her, causing her eyes to close. In her dreamy, half-awake state, Coco could feel a strange sense of security leaning into Richard's embrace. The magic lamp in the room had consumed its resources, eventually dimming. A seat in the corner of the room projected a hazy drizzle of light, giving a touch of serenity to the place. Coco wasn't aware of how long she had slept, but when she woke up the sky was still dark. Richard got off the bed and wore his clothes, just before the door was knocked several times in a certain rhythm before it quieted down again. The loudness and rhythm was a custom, something only the old housekeeper knew. Coco sat up from her bed, still unable to believe that Richard had let her off. However, there was some worry mixed in with that glee. Richard picked up the seat after putting on his clothes. Only once he reached the door did he turn to look at Coco, saying, "I don't plan to change partners." "Oh," Coco replied lightly, the slight trace of hope she'd held out sinking into a valley of despair. Richard was quite aware of Coco's attitude and what she wanted, and even more sure of the reasons behind her actions. The problem was that Coco was the best target if he wanted to maintain his distance from the Arcarans, at least until he returned from the Planar Wars. He had no love nor care for her, so he wasn't going to fulfill her wishes if they inconvenienced him. That was especially true in important affairs. Coco was like a white flower at the foot of a volcano. Fragile yet beautiful, and easy to overlook. People often plucked such things on a whim. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 107. Journey. The old housekeeper shot a glance at Coco as Richard left the room, before closing the door and following him out. He asked along the way, "Master Richard, should I have Coco move to your residence, now that she's your partner? Just as he was about to nod, Richard saw a handsome youth standing in the corner not far away, the same one who'd run up the stairs yesterday. He looked slightly older than himself, about 20 years or so of age, but had good proportions and looked rather fit. He didn't have bulging muscles, but his body still radiated life energy. On top of everything, he was handsome and had distinct features with a pair of clear eyes. Richard noticed that he was a novice knight backup for true rune knights the moment he'd seen him last night. If he grew more powerful within the next few years, to the extent that he could bear 4 runes, he would truly become a rune knight. If he didn't, he would be sent to Sharon territory as a low-ranked officer. Amongst the novice knights were children of far-out branch families, and external elites who'd been selected and trained from their youth. Richard hadn't seen this young man on the night of the banquet, signifying that he was either not an Archaran or was only the offspring of a distant branch with no status to speak of. In other words, he didn't possess the right to have a partner. Richard halted in his steps as he strained his eyes, trying to look at the lad who was pacing back and forth. The young man quickly took his leave as soon as he made eye contact with Richard's cold and indifferent gaze. Richard watched the diminishing back view of the man and his expression fell slightly. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, he told the housekeeper in an unsympathetic tone, "Forget it, let her stay here." The housekeeper nodded in response, not uttering a word. It was as if he did not see the young man at all. A small team was already waiting for Richard at the plaza. He didn't carry much baggage, only a case of clothes and daily essentials, along with another that stored his runecrafting materials. It wasn't Mordred escorting him this time around, instead Dragon Mage Lena. There were also 4 rune knights and 10 light cavalry. The team set off towards the teleportation temple, where Richard saw the first comrade that would accompany him through his planar wars, cleric Flozen of the Church of the Eternal Dragon, titled Daybreak. He got off his horse at High Priestess Furlan's indication, entering Flosan's carriage. Lena scoffed at the carriage at first, but once she got closer her opinion changed. The carriage was for more than just comfort, although it looked like any common noble carriage. There was a spell formation imprinted on the outside that would keep anything happening within completely concealed.